It's honestly a little bit hard to believe that I've owned this silver Rusty EVO for over 2 years now. But basically from the time span of November 2020 to November of 2021, this car kind of went through a complete transformation, and mostly in thanks to ASM for really speeding up that whole transformation, as you'll see if you continue to watch this video. I did some reflecting. I spent some time looking back on videos I made for this car, and this video at large is a combination of all the video blogs I made. And since I've already spent time pre-editing this, I know that this is actually 3 hours worth of content, which is pretty amazing to me, especially since that's just content of video blogs that I made while documenting my process of working on this car. So of course I learned a lot. I spent quite a bit of money, but hopefully you guys learned a lot too. I like to do a lot of this stuff so other people can learn along the way. I made quite a few different how-to videos because of this car. Honestly, one of the ones I'm kind of the happiest with is the fact that I was able to dig into the JDM fuel tank on this car and confirm that that would work, because that was certainly something that I was curious about myself, and I think will help a lot of other future EVO owners down the line. And there's quite the laundry list of things that we have done to this Rusty Silver EVO. Of course, we put in a brand new OEM short block. We rebuilt the cylinder head, put in the JDM fuel tank, put in a brand new oil cooler, put in our new ACT mod twin clutch, and used EVO 9 turbo. We had to rework our Rusty shifter linkage and put in some new shifter bushings. We had to put in some used suspension, put in a brand new STM downpipe, a lot of other miscellaneous things, and of course we had to go through our safety recall. I don't really know what the future holds for this EVO, but for now this is kind of a wrap up on everything for this build, if you will. I really think the best option for this car is to still hopefully find a clean shell and swap all the drivetrain and stuff over to a clean shell, but clean shell prices are still super expensive. Unfortunately, the most financial sense for this car right now is still just to actually part it out, unfortunately. I can't say I plan to do that right away, but I don't know. It could be something that it comes to. As a YouTuber, you kind of need more content. I've kind of ran out of content for this car. But again, reflecting on this, I was very happy that, you know, when I look back at some of the first videos I made, I was like, well, I want to take this thing ice racing. I want to take it spectator racing on the dirt track. And of course, if you followed this build, that's what I was able to do. So that was an awesome bonus to be able to do those things that I had set out to do. But that's all I got for this intro to this video. I just wanted to give you guys some context to what you're about to watch. Again, we're piecing together all the videos that I made for the video blogs, so you can just have one big long video to view if you wanted to ingest it that way. Ingest it? Digest it? Probably digest it that way. But also, if you like my channel and you have a EVO shell that you actually want to sell for a reasonable price, I wouldn't even need an EVO 8 EVO shell. Let me know. It would be cool to kind of keep this car going with a new shell, but it's very hard, like I said, to find a decent EVO. Otherwise, stay tuned to see what happens, because maybe I'll end up parting this thing out, and then I'll of course document that stuff and see if I can reward my subscribers and followers some way with that. Also, before we get into the main video, I just want to say I'm going to link in the video description down below on YouTube to all the how-to videos I made while doing this car, because I'm not actually including the how-tos in this whole 3-hour-long video. This 3-hour-long video is just more of the journey of documenting, putting all the blogs together, the video blogs, like I said. And that's it for my intro to this video. As always, thanks everybody for watching. Now we're gonna cut to me a couple years younger. What's up guys, it's Paul from Boosted Films, and I am super excited to introduce my viewers to a new EVO project that I picked up. And this is an EVO project car in a completely different way than my black one was a project car. My loyal subscribers know this one I picked up as a roller, no engine, no trans. Did a lot of work to that one, a lot of missing parts I had to find. This car is a complete car, probably one of the cheapest complete EVOs you will find. I got it for $6,000. So how the heck do you get an EVO so cheap? Well, two main reasons. Number one, this EVO spent its entire life in Wisconsin, which is where I live. When a car is driven all year round in a state that has snow and ice and they put salt down on the roads, it just ends up eating away at a car like this, any other car that you drive too much and don't wash or don't take the best care of, and even if you do try to take really good care of it, if you drive a car in the winter a lot, you're probably going to end up with rust issues. That's going to be one of the main deterrents about this car, is really that it is rusty, very rusty. It definitely needs body work. There's some rust areas on the body that need to be fixed. There's some rust areas probably underneath that need to be looked at. I'm not entirely sure the extent of everything yet that will need to be fixed with the rust. And the second reason this Evo is so cheap is simply the mileage. This car has over 210,000 miles on it, so it is a high mileage Evo. But again, this is a full car. It came with everything. The engine actually does kind of run. But at 210,000 miles, I'm certainly not anticipating it really being a healthy engine. I'm hoping I can get the car running and make it drivable, and then kind of really sort out any drivability issues before I kind of dig into what it actually needs as far as engine, transmission, clutch. So most likely this isn't really going to be like a build project. It's going to be more of a restore project. I'm hoping I can get this car back up, you know, make it roadworthy, and then also have a car that I don't feel so bad about taking ice racing or taking to the dirt track, because doing that with this car does not seem appropriate anymore now that I've spent so much time on the body and getting this one so clean, and the fact that this one was a Texas car to begin with, so there is really no rust on my black Evo. Another thing that's pretty amazing to me about this car is honestly, it is very, very stock. I know a lot of people say, oh, my Evo is pretty stock. It only has exhaust, cams, injectors, intercooler, you know, and they still say it's stock. This one, the only modifications that I can really tell is it swapped out the 8 blow-off valve to a 9, and the seats are actually swapped out from an 8 to a 9. Otherwise, it still has a stock front mount intercooler. It still has the stock air intake system. It still has the stock intercooler sprayer, which I think almost everyone usually rips out. And last but not least, it is going to be ripped off, but it currently has the stock exhaust on here. So plans moving forward, like I said, I'd like to really dig into hopefully the engine first. I want to see if I can get this engine running well. And if I can get the engine running even fairly well, then the next steps will just be to make it drivable. This car has been sitting for over a year. Apparently it has a fuel leak that will need to be looked into. The brakes will need to be replaced. Anything that you would need to touch maintenance-wise from a car that sat for a year will probably have to be addressed. And if you follow Evo prices closely, you still might be thinking, well, $6,000 seems like a lot of money. Of course, it is a lot of money to me, but if you look at prices of parting this car out, you could pretty easily get $6,000 out of it if you sold everything that came with this car. I'm also contemplating switching the seats. I thought about maybe taking the 9 seats out of here since they're really nice and clean and putting them into my 8, taking the 8 seats out of my black one, putting them into the silver car. They're not super great condition for the 9 seats, but they are better overall, and they are just Evo 9 seats. So I don't know, what do you think? Would you swap in the 9 seats over to the cleaner car? So that is an introduction to my new project Evo. Hopefully, if nothing else for my viewers, you should be happy to know that you should be getting some more fresh content as I film myself diagnosing and trying to figure out issues with this. And again, tackling like this at a new angle. There's gonna be rust issues. There's going to be other problems with high mileage items that I'm going to have to deal with on this car that I didn't deal with so much on building my first Evo 8 roller. And I'm curious of your opinion. I don't know, would you have paid $6,000 for this car? Do you think I got ripped off? Do you think I should just part it out? I'm sure it would be less work to part it out and maybe make a few $1,000s, but I kind of want to save this car. I want it to be back on the road again. I want to be able to race it again. I do think it would be a great car to end up on the dirt track or do some ice racing when it gets cold enough here in Wisconsin. Go do some ice autocross racing. It'll be a lot of fun. What's going on, guys? Just trying to do a little update on the condition of this silver Evo, that Rusty Evo that I picked up, and documenting what I've found so far digging into it. So I removed the front bumper cover and the actual front bumper and took out the headlights. Pretty much about what I expected. A lot of this is surface rust, so it's not too bad. And ideally what I'm going to do with a lot of this stuff is potentially at least sand it down and then paint it to at least try to keep it from rusting. It's not like a permanent fix, but just something to make it a little better. This bumper itself is still structurally sound, it's just obviously rusty, so I'll probably end up sanding it and maybe sandblasting it and then repainting it. The headlights themselves came out just fine, other than the fact that these bolts broke on both sides. I should be able to potentially drill and tap it. And then also the bolt on the headlight itself that screws to the fender here. Those bolts broke, but that's actually fine because there's just a clip where it clips into the headlight that you can just pop that clip out. So that's okay. The headlights are 100% fine, functional. Haven't dug into the engine yet. Next steps hopefully are going to be a compression test and a leak down test. And before that, I might check the timing as well and see if the timing is right. So I did swap seats already. I'll probably do a how-to on that. So I took the seats out of here and I didn't bother putting them back in. I didn't bother putting in the EVO 8 seats that were in my black car. So I swapped the seats in. It's kind of dark in here yet. And I will do a how-to on that, even though it's pretty simple, but I'll post that soon. We got our headlights in here. One thing, if you follow me on social media, on Instagram at least, I started digging into the back here the other day, and one big thing, this is awful. I mean, it's about what I expected for rust, but the problem is when someone just decides to put self-tapping screws to hold down the fuel sending unit, because all the studs that would typically hold the unit down are broken off. And then we lift up the carpet here. This is what it looks like, and I'm not too surprised, and I'm gonna look into it, but I don't think I'm super concerned as far as like structural integrity. It is the floor pan, basically, I believe you'd call it. You know, like in the older muscle cars, they replace these all the time because that's where they rust. And there's a little bit of rust here where it's enough where you see that light. That's obviously a hole straight through. So that's what we're dealing with the rust condition. It's a little surprising to see surface rust even right here. I still haven't dug underneath the car yet, so I'm not sure how bad it will be underneath. But the interior was pretty nice. The seats came out just fine, so that's good. Here's our quarter panel rust. I will be most likely pulling the rear bumper off and doing the same thing as I'm trying to do to the front. I'm going to take the bumper cover off, see how much rust there is, and then also take the actual metal bumper off and then sand it and paint it, stuff like that. Anything I can do that's relatively cheap and that will keep the rust from continuing on. And I'm kind of making more work for myself, pulling these headlights out and all this stuff, but I figure I'm going to run into that issue sooner or later. So right now is a good time to, you know, break the bolts that are going to have to get broken and then have time to try to fix them properly if possible. That's about it for right now. I'll probably work on dropping the exhaust eventually too. I might look into dropping the gas tank, which if you followed my other video blog, you know that dropping the gas tank I thought was one of the biggest pain in the butt jobs that you could even have on a car like this. But it might have to be done because that gas tank itself might actually be, well, no surprise, I'm sure it's going to be rusty. So as long as it's not actually leaking fuel somewhere, it could work for a while. But ideally, we're going to try to get this thing going again and try not to spend a lot of money while we're doing it. That's kind of the plan, but we shall see. And look at this, that's pretty. I also took the wheels off and swapped on a different set of wheels. These are the same wheels I used for spectator racing. I had, you know, an extra set. So I put these ones on, took the other ones off, changed out some of the lug nuts. Some of the old lug nuts were just rusted and getting crappy. Again, no surprise. So before they could cause any more issue, I took them off and just threw them away and then added some better OEM lug nuts. And some of this stuff up front too, it doesn't look as bad, you know, as it could potentially be. As far as this radiator support doesn't look too bad. There's some rust in there, but that, you know, structurally sound up there. This part too is probably the worst of it. It's definitely not good, but it's not going to just fall apart anytime soon. And the frame rail itself up here is pretty good. Again, I'm not an expert at what is going to be the most structural part of this, where I really need to watch for rust as far as what needs to be taken care of, but I'm just kind of guessing and paying attention, trying to figure out where it is rusty that really would need to be fixed. So that's it, guys. Just wanted to do a little update on the condition and actually just document this. So hopefully one day when it's a lot cleaner under here, I'll have some footage to throw up and compare and show you how ugly it once was and all that fun stuff. So documenting the progression on this Rusty EVO, there are three main things I'm running into right now. Number one, the crank position sensor has a broken bolt. There's two bolts that hold the crank position sensor in place, and one of those bolts broke off. And even before that, that crank position sensor, a plastic piece of it was broken. And that crank position sensor was all gummed up to the one that was on here. So I'm thinking that's part of the reason it ran like crap. I'm kind of hoping that was actually the issue. I checked the timing. It is in time, so that should be good as far as I don't think it skipped timing. It shouldn't have bent any valves, so that's good. But I need to fix that bolt and try to remove that broken bolt. And in an effort to do that, I had drilled a hole right in the center, and I thought this is going to work great. I put in an extractor that was supposed to extract it out, but it was a cheap Harbor Freight extractor. And guess what happened? You know, that piece broke off inside the bolt that was broken off. Thought it was going to spin out, but instead it just broke. So now I'm still dealing with that. It's been a pain. Second issue is this battery stuff was kind of corroded, and where the battery positive terminal meets this fuse panel was also kind of corroded with those wires, so I took those off. I wanted to clean them up. One came off and cleaned up just fine. The other one I'm trying to take off and clean up, but in my effort to do that, I can see I basically broke the fuse. There's like a jumper fuse between those two cables. I'm hoping I can replace just that part, but I inadvertently broke that while trying to loosen up that bolt. I will say I've been getting a little better at feeling out whether or not bolts are going to break off. I still actually want to invest in some kind of heat gun or something that will heat them up and actually increase my chances of removing them without breaking them, because every broken bolt is going to cause a lot more headaches down the line. But one of the most discouraging things I found is I was able to remove the exhaust, and in the back of the car there was some rust that was very much hidden by the exhaust being in place that I didn't see before. And there's some bad rust back there that honestly I'm not sure if it's fixable or not. I'm not sure if it's worth fixing or not. It's really discouraging, but I just want to document this stuff as I go. I want to see your opinions, your thoughts. I don't know if any of my viewers have seen rust this bad in the back and fixed. I think everything is probably fixable, but sometimes you reach that point where your time and money might not be worth it. It might really just be a thing of it'd be easier to find a cleaner roller and try to take the drivetrain out of this one, put it in that one, see if I can recoup some of my money on different areas, selling different parts off of this one. I don't really know for sure. But speaking of that, trying to fund a little bit more of this project, I had some people messaging me about stock parts on my last video, or commenting, I should say, about stock parts. There are some stock parts I probably would be willing to sell, because this car, you know, despite the fact that it's all in its stock form, is never going to be worth a lot of money in its stock form again, I don't think, because of the high mileage and because of the rust. And just to be a car that I want to enjoy, it's probably not going to be stock anyway. But if you're looking for certain hard to find little trinkets, little small pieces that you usually can't find, send me a message, let me know. Maybe I'll sell it if you want to buy some little things. So that's the status of where I am with this Rusty EVO project. But again, I just want to document things as I go, show you guys, you know, the struggles that I'm dealing with. Hopefully, probably showing you stuff that other people would never want to really show you, because, you know, it doesn't look good. I'm still having some fun overall with this, but of course, there always reaches that point where certain things just get very discouraging along the way, and You got to find some wins along the way. I'm looking for those yet. I'm really hoping one of them will be getting the engine actually up and running, the mighty 4G63, and this hopefully has still got some life left in her where she's going to run for a little while. And I just keep in mind I like having a car to tinker with. So right now at least I have something that I can play around with in my garage every now and then without digging unnecessarily into my good Evo. There's a popular saying with cars: cheap, reliable, fast, pick two. Welcome back to the Ugly Evo Build blog series. We're here in my tiny little garage in the cold weather of Wisconsin, trying to do some more work on the Evo. And in this video, I'm gonna cover my new plan for this car, an update on the crankshaft position sensor. We'll talk about an awesome tool called a magnetic heat induction gun, talk about changing out the cross member, my front center member, if you will, and a bit about an OEM catalytic converter and how much money that can bring. So let's start off with the plan. You know how I said cheap, reliable, fast, pick two? Well, that's pretty dang true when it comes to the car world. But with this Evo, my plan here is to kind of make it a unique, maybe ugly Evo, if you will. Because if you think about it, a lot of times people spend a lot of money to make their Evo look nice. Things like the headlights, front bumpers, you know, a nice paint job, all that stuff can really add up. So my idea here with this Evo now is to kind of not care as much about the cosmetic part of it and just try to invest in, you know, the drivetrain and invest in other areas of the car and maybe keep it more unique, ugly looking car, and that can hopefully cut down my cost. And since I can really be all about the numbers kind of guy, if you want to join me for this journey, I have a link to a spreadsheet down below, and I'm going to keep track of all the costs that I have in this car and even some potential cost, what I think things are worth, a high and low range for what I would potentially get if I parted this out. If all you're curious in is kind of the Evo pricing, paying attention to that too and just keeping track. And speaking of that, so far, I think on the last video I showed you I removed the exhaust. Well, I was dang surprised to bring in the catalytic converter to a scrapyard, and that was worth $470, which is pretty ridiculous to me. I've always heard, you know, maybe $100 to $300. Of course, prices always fluctuate with stuff like that, but just an FYI, if you have an OEM catalytic converter, it's worth over $450 right now. So that was one way to help offset the cost. Another thing you'll notice if you look on the spreadsheet is I sold the OEM wheels. I don't know if you can technically count that in this or not. I have like 4 sets of different wheels for Evos, so I just figured I would sell the ones that were on here. So that means so far I've knocked off about $1,000 off my purchase price of this car. Other things I hope to sell is the OEM front bumper, since it is complete and in relatively good shape. So I'm hoping I might just be able to sell that and then buy some cheap one, buy a banged up one. Again, I'm not looking for perfect with this car. If it has, you know, nicks, scrapes, cuts out of it, I'm gonna be fine with that for this one, at least for now. Same thing with headlights. I'll probably try to do the same thing. The headlights on this car were pretty nice, so I'll probably try and sell those and maybe pick up some cheaper headlights that, you know, have cracked or scratched and try to offset some money that way. So right now that's the plan for this car. That's the way I'm going to try to keep my investment low. I'm also publicly sharing the ad revenue that I'm going to get from YouTube videos as well. So of course I appreciate all my viewers watching. You know, I know it sucks having so many ads sometimes on YouTube videos, but they really do kind of help in the long run. So I'm going to keep that and include that in this as well, because of course it all takes work. I'm standing outside on a 20-degree day right now. Spent about an hour just setting things up to film this video too. And if you watch all my videos, you probably saw the one about the front center member where I bought an aftermarket bar to put on my black Evo out there. And I took the stock one off the black Evo that was on there and put it on this car. So that's one thing I did. And then, like a man discovering fire for the first time, I discovered these magnetic heat induction guns that actually, this one worked awesome while it worked. It actually, you know, I had it running for maybe 15 minutes of its total life, and then it just decided to stop working. So I got a refund for this one, and actually a different one just showed up. I spent a little bit more money. This one was about $250 on Amazon. I just picked up a different one that was about $350 on Amazon. So I'm gonna try that one because these do work pretty awesome. I'm gonna show some video now of the bolts that I got out is really amazing. I mean, people had commented even that I was going to certainly break off the bolts that hold the back bumper in place. Well, I already got some of them off before this broke on me. But if you can get to an area where you can heat up a bolt, the thread part of the bolt more specifically, kind of if there was a nut and a bolt together, if you could heat up the nut area, even if that's fixed in place on a car, this worked awesome. It definitely, bolts would have totally broke off if I didn't use this heater. I know of a torch. I know a torch works. I've had experience with torches in the past, but again, I'm in a small garage here that doesn't have a lot of room. And what the torch doesn't really do is actually kind of heat equally. You know, it's very hard to heat up. You'd have to kind of spin around to heat up the right area, and you could also kind of melt stuff with a torch. So for me, being in a small garage, this seemed like a great idea, and it kind of was. And I'll just see if the new one lasts a little bit longer. And a little bit of good news, I was actually able to get the crankshaft position sensor broken bolt removed. If you remember in the last one, there was a broken bolt. There's 2 bolts that hold the crankshaft position sensor in place. I was able to get out the broken stuff on that one with something called the rescue bit. Someone messaged me about this, thank you to whoever it was, on Instagram, and asked me if I'd heard of this, and I said no, so I just, well, it was like 40 bucks or something. It took a while to ship to me, but it's a decent cutter. It seems to cut pretty well, and then what's nice about it is you can kind of actually move it around. Unlike a drill, where you kind of just drill and have to drill straight in place, with this you could actually drill in place and then move it a little, you know, to kind of offset. So if you weren't right centered, it worked out okay. So it's certainly not ideal, but then I was able to run a tap through, and it fits a little bit loose, but the bolt will hold it in place. At least it seems like it should. So that's one step forward. I still haven't fully swapped out the crank position sensor because I need to remove a lot of stuff to actually get the new one in place. But as you can see, the old one looked pretty crappy, and I'm really hoping this was the reason the car was running like crap, and I hope to find out soon. One other thing is I kind of made more work for myself with that stupid fuse I showed you in the last video as well. I still haven't gotten that one loose. I need to change that out. And again, it's been so cold and crappy, I haven't really done a whole lot with the car lately because it's just been tough to get out and work on it. But hopefully before I dig too much deeper, that's what's going to happen. I'm hoping I can get the car running, or at least see if it can run normal, get it up to normal operating temperature for a while, and then hopefully do a compression test and a leak down test. I kind of want to make videos on those processes as well. And I mentioned earlier that I did remove the rear bumper cover and then got to the rear bumper area. I didn't take the actual rear crash beam off yet just because I didn't have the heat gun fully functioning to get all those bolts out. But of course, as some of you on Instagram already saw, the rust looks really crappy back there. I'm not too surprised that there's kind of a hole in that area. And when it comes to what I really want to do with this car, which is going to be ice racing, probably won't happen this season, but maybe next year, and then bring it out on the dirt track, stuff like that isn't going to be the end of the world. I'm hoping, you know, as I dig into it though, the structural stuff, the structural rust that needs to be fixed, I'm hoping I can fix that myself, or, you know, find someone that's reasonably priced to get that rust fixed. It's alive. The Rusty EVO actually kind of runs and drives. That's right, the mighty 4G63 in this EVO with 200,000 plus miles actually runs, and it seems to run okay. It's hitting on all cylinders. Of course, I haven't fully diagnosed the health of the engine yet to say how good it really is, but it's a good sign, it's a good step in the right direction that it seems to actually run a bit better now. So what did we do since the last episode to get this thing actually running and driving? Well, we changed out 3 main things. One of them was that crankshaft position sensor. The other was the serpentine pulley that holds the serpentine belt on. And then the third thing was an idle air control valve. But just to document a couple items that I want to say about changing each of those 3 items. First of all, that crankshaft position sensor, that is pretty tough to change, really. It's, even when I depinned the connection, you kind of still have to remove a lot of stuff to get basically to that, behind that timing cover, behind the power steering pump. That's really not an easy thing to change. I don't have a full how-to on that, but I'm just going to say now that it's definitely not the easiest thing to change on this car. Second thing, removing this serpentine pulley. This one, on this Rusty car was, of course, like everything else, pretty much just rusted and stuck in place. So with this serpentine pulley, the main reason I had to change it was not only because it was basically stuck in place, but because to release the tension on this, what you end up doing is putting in a 1/2-inch ratchet into this portion here, and then you should be able to move it. And then actually there's two little holes here where once it's moved far enough, you could stick something through to hold it in place. But what happened with this one is this piece was actually broken off. So I couldn't even really do much to relieve the tension on this. So I ended up just taking off a pulley to get the belt off itself. But this leads me to a little bit about what I talked about in my last video about titanium bolts. This bolt here, obviously it's not actually titanium, but I had the same issue with this black Evo when it comes to like finding the right size bolt. After this one actually broke off and was stuck in place, I had a hard time finding the right bolt. Now in this black Evo, of course, I just didn't know what size it was supposed to be because I bought this one as a roller and it had no reference point. So that led me to start making a document where I want to index almost all the bolts for the Evo. You know, that's a lofty project. I don't know if I'll do all the bolts, but hopefully at least the most common ones. And maybe it's something where we can all try to work together to get something documented. But I have a link to that spreadsheet in the description of this video. So if you want to check that out, I want to, like I said, index a lot of these bolts and then give you specific dimension of the bolts if you want to buy them somewhere, like just a regular Fastenal or a store by you. But then also I want to include links to buy OEM, if OEM is still an option. I want to include links to buy titanium. So I'm hoping that's something that you guys will find helpful. And again, a main reason I thought of it is because this bolt itself here, like the specs for this bolt, it's like, where do you find the thing? So that was the second item I changed. And then the third item was the idle air control valve. When I pulled it out of this one, after I had kind of got this thing running, it kind of ran, but I had to keep holding, the throttle down to give it a little gas to keep it from running. And it still just seemed like it was off. So I was like, I should definitely check this idle air control valve. And sure thing, basically this like plunger is stuck up. I think it was stuck open. And really this is what was making the car run so bad. And actually I'm amazed that it could run so bad just because of this little piece. So I had a used one laying around back from when I was playing around with this one. So I put that in, and then amazingly enough, I was able to drive the car. It was pretty awesome. And of course, when I'm doing this, I just want to share what I'm learning. And honestly, one of the things I'm learning about this process is that you kind of need restraint when you're doing something with a project like this, because of course the end goal is to swap out quite a few different parts and not leave it as stock as it is now. So it's very tempting to rip something off, like, and just take it off. I have an Evo 9 Turbo here, and I was going to put it on, and realistically I was like, I don't need to do that right now, and it could only cause more problems, more potential problems to find out what's keeping the car from running well. And I think that's why sometimes when you see an Evo for sale somewhere and they're like, it's a full car but it's in pieces, I get why that happens, because you kind of get into things where you're like, well, I'm going to change this anyway, and then you kind of lose motivation, really, because all of a sudden you're like, well, I have this whole car that needs to be put back together. Because this thing was rusty, of course, I had to pay more attention to loosening things up and making sure bolts didn't break, but then I would kind of, all right, get them loose, maybe put some anti-seize on them, put things back together. Because the main goal right now is really just to get a running and driving car. You can worry about modifying things after that. So I tried to keep all that in mind when I was working on this car, and also when I was looking at parts to order. It's like, of course I want a different front mount intercooler, stuff like that, but it's like I don't need that right now. So I focus on things that'll get this car up, running, and driving. Like I ordered brand new brake rotors, I ordered a brand new OEM gas tank, which, to go into that a little bit, if you didn't know, the OEM gas tanks for this are technically discontinued, at least in the US market. I found one from a place in Ireland, and it's not here yet, so hopefully it does show up, but I'll probably do a whole video exactly just on that. If you actually watched my video with this car, I dropped the tank on this and put the tank back up, and it was quite the job. But I'd really like to document the full gas tank swap, and also if it is a JDM tank that I'm getting that's new, I want to go over how you'd actually make that work and make that fit, because I feel like this might be an issue a lot of Evo people will have to deal with sooner or later. So what's next with the Silver EVO? Well, right now the clutch grabs like right off the floor. It grabs really quick. I need to check that out, see if I can make it any better. I have not swapped in the ACT twin disc yet. That's basically next order of business when I kind of hopefully get this running and driving as it is. It also seems to have some shifting issues with the shifter linkage. So I'm gonna have to remove the battery and kind of dig around with that shifter linkage area, try to see if I can get that sorted out as well. And of course the suspension and brake components, you know, making sure this car is roadworthy and that, you know, little things won't hold me up. I wanna get this car to Andy at ASM too. I believe I'm gonna get it there, and that's gonna fast track things a little bit. He's gonna help me drop the transmission a lot quicker, put in that new ACT twin disc clutch, get that sorted out. And I want to apologize for not really having as much footage of me actually working on this car. Since I'm not really creating how-to videos for these specific things I'm doing at the moment, I'm not documenting everything, you know, because of that, and also because sometimes it's super cold out here and this garage is pretty small, pretty tight. So hopefully you understand that's why I'm not exactly filming everything that I do. But of course, if you have any questions, you can let me know. I can try to help as much as I can. And I'm also just trying to document stuff here and just explain stuff along the way as well, so you have a reference for things like that crankshaft position sensor, like knowing that you really can't get that out without removing your power steering pump, removing a lot of other stuff to get to that. I think that could be helpful if you were just thinking about digging into it and thinking you could just swap it out pretty quickly, to know that it's not really an easy job. Even if you would deep in that connector, you really can't funnel it through. So quite a few changes I've made since the last video already. I swapped out the valve cover, I added the full exhaust, got that installed, swapped in a brand new OEM oil pressure switch, made a how-to video on that as well, installed an aftermarket air intake and the mass airflow sensor adapter, installed a new upper intercooler pipe, and finally, in a move that turned out to be getting a little too confident, I installed the lower timing belt cover. And why was that a little premature? Well, when I got all these changes made, I went to start it up and it didn't seem to run quite right. Sometimes it would idle for a little bit, and then it did this. And after that, the car did this. So yeah, the Evo was in the mood to crank but not start. So I had to try to troubleshoot and see what I did. Of course, I made these changes. I talked in my previous video about trying not to do modifications, but you know, if there's a good deal that comes up, I'm still gonna do it. So I ended up putting on the air intake and the upper intercooler pipe, as I mentioned. And I thought, well, maybe something with that screwed it up, but realistically, it probably wasn't gonna be something, because if it's a crank, no start issue, it wouldn't really be because of a boost leak or anything like that. I also changed some vacuum lines while I was in there, put some new vacuum lines on. So I had to do some more troubleshooting, some more diagnostics. So I did bust out the Evo scan. I did see what codes it would send to me. And it basically said something about the camshaft position sensor and the crankshaft position sensor. So I hadn't touched the camshaft position sensor at all on this car yet. So I figured I could start there. That's actually an easy thing to test. It's really easy to swap that out. And since I have the black Evo here, I just took the good one, the one I knew was good, off the black Evo, and I installed it on the silver Evo. Same result, the car would crank, but it wouldn't start. So I figured the next thing, and the thing I was a little worried about, was actually that crankshaft position sensor again. And of course, the reason I was worried about that is because I did a makeshift fix on that, where one of the bolts broke off on that part where it bolts in. There are two bolts that hold that crankshaft position sensor in place, and one of them had broken off, so I had to drill it out and try to rethread a little bit, and I had a bolt that would hold it in place, but I couldn't really tighten it up as much as I wanted to without feeling like it would strip. So lo and behold, I had to take that lower timing belt cover back off again, and everything appeared to be normal, but once I unbolted that crankshaft position sensor, I could see that the sensor trigger blade actually had rubbed against that sensor, and I think that's basically because that second bolt that I tried to fix really isn't holding things in place correctly. So I can't say I'm super surprised. It's gonna lead to more work, but I mean, the good news is I feel like I have enough confidence in the engine now where I don't feel like I'd be totally wasting my time and money to spend some money on parts for like timing components. And what I'm gonna have to do now is change the whole front case, basically, that holds the oil pump And that front case, when I change that on the front part of the engine, that'll give me just a whole new mounting point for that crankshaft position sensor. So I guess good news for you guys, I'll try to document that as I go. I usually don't make how-to videos on stuff until I've done it like at least twice. So I don't know if I'll specifically do a how-to video on changing that front case and that oil pump area, but at least I will film some of it and I'll have some insight into it if people do have questions on that. So I'll just touch a little bit more about the valve cover. I picked up a cheap used valve cover for like 60 bucks. So in an effort to kind of keep things cheap and ugly on this car, I picked up this valve cover that had a broken ear on it where it goes by the cam gears. I'm just gonna sell the stock OEM valve cover that was on this car most likely, since that one is in good shape other than it needs kind of paint, but it doesn't have anything broken on it. But the one I picked up for cheap is totally functional. It's just kind of ugly. And regarding the air intake, just kind of a note here for anyone else that might be looking for couplers and stuff. The coupler that actually goes onto the mass airflow sensor is bigger than a 3-inch. It's like 3.25 inch, 83, 84 millimeter. So it can be a tricky coupler to find. So just a heads up on that. If you're buying an air intake, an aftermarket air intake setup where you're utilizing the stock mass airflow sensor, if it doesn't come with couplers that go on, just note it might be a bit tricky to find the right one that works for you. So what's next? Well, as I mentioned, I'm going to have to change that front case on the engine. So that means I'm removing all the timing components, basically do a timing belt job while I'm in there. I'm just going to change the water pump, do a lot of other things that just need to be changed. The good news is, even if the engine ends up not being that good overall, if it's low on compression or if it breaks right away, honestly, those components should still be good and transferable, or I'd utilize those same components if I do end up having to do an engine rebuild or something like that. While I had the car up in the air, I also did some checking and I noticed that the wheel bearing, at least on that passenger side, the front passenger wheel bearing is basically going bad. No surprise there either. So I picked up a new pair of wheel bearings. I'm probably going to change both front wheel bearings and do those sometime soon. And also the brand new OEM gas tank I mentioned in the last video has arrived. And unfortunately in this case it is a JDM gas tank, so I'm not 100% sure it will fit yet. I've had some people tell me it should fit no problem, but there are certainly some things that I'll need to change to make it work perfectly. So that's something I'm still looking into, so stay tuned. So it's been over 3 months since I've done an update video on the ugly Evo build, but things are about to start moving a lot faster. Now, before I get into an update on the status of the Rusty Silver Evo build, I just want to touch on 2 different things that I've been doing recently. Number 1, I made a video about my Evo, the black one that went to the spectator race recently, so if you want to check that out, that video is up and live on my channel. Link in the video description. Same with One Lap of America trip. That's been taking up a lot of my time. I followed Super K, this awesome Honda S2000, and I would really appreciate if you actually started watching those videos if you haven't already. It's a documentary, so I understand not everyone's into documentaries, and I know most of you are Evo, based people, but even so, I think if you just give it a chance, you'll really like watching this story about the One Lap of America trip. Now, where did we leave off with the ugly silver Evo build? Well, it used to be here in this garage and it's no longer here. But a couple things I had to do before I could get it out of here. Well, I just kind of had to put it back together. I did some work on the front hubs, the front spindles. I had them powder coated, I had them cleaned up, I had to reinstall them with a couple new other parts as well. ABS sensors were just stuck in there. They were pretty much a lost cause. Had to smash those out to get them out. Did an install video on that for anyone looking at more information on installing some of those front wheel components. Put in new front wheel bearings as well at the same time. So I did all that, got it back together. I was troubleshooting. As you may remember, the crankshaft position sensor seemed to be having issues. The car seemed to run fine until I kind of diagnosed that crank position sensor seemed to have hit the blade, the trigger blade that it passes through. So I tried a different crankshaft position sensor and it still didn't seem to fix my issue. And at this point I was just kind of getting frustrated with it. So I was talking with Andy at ASM and he just said I could bring it out to his shop. So I got the car back together, trailered it up again, and this time I trailered it over to Andy's shop so I could let him diagnose it a bit quicker than I would be able to find out whatever the heck was going on with this Evo. So one thing that Andy noticed right away is that he seemed like the clutch pedal had a very heavy feel, which I noticed too, but I didn't think a whole lot of it. And he's like, man, it feels like it's putting a lot of pressure. It's trying to kill the engine kind of when you're pushing in the clutch. And I'm like, It seemed like it was a stock clutch in there. I believe the previous owner told me it was. It seemed like the car, you know, was not modified hardly at all when I got it. So I didn't think there would be a heavy clutch in there. So of course, that was one clue. Taking out that crankshaft position sensor is another clue to what you all probably already know by the thumbnail of this video. But what ended up happening is it turns out the engine with 210,000 miles has crank walk. Now, crank walk is a common issue. It's basically where the thrust bearings in the crank kind of allow it to move more than it should. And realistically, that's a very common issue with the 4G63s, but more so I've seen usually in the DSM world, the Eagle Talons, Plymouth Lasers, stuff like that. They're usually the ones that you see suffer that failure a bit more than the Evo 8 or 9s. However, Andy was able to diagnose this issue, so we knew that, hey, that's the problem. Basically, you need to get the engine rebuilt or find a new one. So once Andy had the engine out and pulled the cylinder head off, I was able to take a look at everything. And yeah, the actual engine itself looked pretty good with the head off. I was amazed, you know, for an engine that has 210,000 miles, there's wasn't a lot of piston wear on the side skirts in the cylinder wall and stuff like that. The engine itself actually didn't really look that bad, of course, for having so many miles. But again, with the crank walk, with the thrust bearings, you know, being bad, it still needs to be replaced. And honestly, I had to sleep on it. This was a turning point for me when I found out, you know, that it needed this much, basically, money that's going to be stuck into it. I can't say I was totally surprised, but at the same time, when it comes right down to it, when you're like, well, now I need to make a decision, put in a lot of money, or just part out this car. And you know, I kind of thought well, parting it out, I could probably get my money back. I wouldn't be sticking more money into it. And somehow part of me is going, you know, when you stick more money into it, at the end of the day, what do you end up with? You end up with just a Rusty EVO still, and you have more money into it. And most people don't want to buy a Rusty EVO. So on the financial side of it, I honestly thought about it. I was like, I might just give up on this thing, just part it out, cut my losses. Pretty sure I could get my money back. Trying to think of other creative things I could maybe do with the car. But then I just let go of my better judgment and ordered a brand new OEM short block. So I do have that coming on the way. I'm gonna keep doing this. I'm gonna keep pursuing this car. I'm hoping, that this now, just putting in this new OEM short block, putting on the old head, getting the car then back together will actually get me a running and driving car. And then I can go from there and see what happens. At the end of the day, I am fine investing money in the drivetrain of an Evo, because I still feel like even though I have a Rusty EVO at the end of the day, the drivetrain itself is still going to probably retain its value, if not increase in its value. And having two Evos, you know, it's nice that I could have something for this one as backup as needed. So I also want to keep making more videos for you guys. I want to make more videos along the way, fixing stuff, learning more stuff, and sharing that with you guys. So that's it. I made that decision. The OEM short block is on its way. I'm pretty excited, and hopefully within a couple months, maybe sooner, I might be driving the Silver EVO, and we'll get to put in that ACT twin disc clutch since everything's already dropped out. So that's gonna be really cool too, to hopefully get that clutch in and test that out, since I know a lot of you guys have been messaging me about that as well. So that's about it for this update video, guys. As I mentioned before, you know, sorry for the delay, but you know me, I'm trying not to just put out content for the sake of putting out content. I want to have something to talk about or something to show you in the process. So it's taken a couple months, but I'm going to keep moving along on this car. A huge shout out, special thanks to Andy from ASM. Awesome, so gracious for him to help me out with this project. Previously on the Ugly Evo build blog. We got no engines, do we? Oh wait, there it is. Yeah, it just says crank walk. Time for a new one. What's up, guys? It's Paul from Boosted Films coming at you with an Evo build blog video update. And this one's a little bit different than normal. As I mentioned previously, things are going quite quickly, and it's faster for me to do these videos if I do a voiceover as opposed to being on camera. So here we are. So in this episode, we're going to cover cleaning up the engine bay. We're getting rid of a lot of that surface rust that was there. We're going to make it look a lot nicer than I thought it could even turn out to be, honestly. And then we're going to look at tearing down the throttle body. I already released this video, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then I'm also going to go into tearing down the cylinder head and talk a bit more about what I'm going to put in new in the cylinder head as we go. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the new OEM short block that just arrived. First things first, keeping things in chronological order. The first thing I did was actually get this car outside. It's at the shop at ASM. We got it outside so I could work on it in basically more of a fresh air environment, and of course give them room to work on important stuff inside the shop. So the first thing you're going to see here is basically a lot of components still had to be removed from the car. So I took off a lot of the front pieces here, that front bumper, you know, the air conditioning stuff. I took all that off so we could get a good view of actually how bad this rust is. And honestly, it's not as bad as it looks. And you know, most of this is a lot of surface rust. This lower part where the radiator mounts in was actually probably one of the worst spots, but everything is still solid. It's going to hold stuff in place. So you'll see later on that it actually cleans up fairly well. And judging by some comments from my last video, it seemed like a lot of people wanted a how-to on this, and I hope this is enough. This isn't really going to be a how-to because, I mean, the how-to of this is a basic paint work, honestly. A lot of it's in the prep. You need to be able to get rid of all the old rust as best you can. You got to sand everything down. You got to clean everything up as best you can. You got to tape off the areas you don't want to be painted, and then you have to just repaint it. Well, prime it and then paint it. So this is certainly not an how-to, and I've mentioned this before, and I will probably mention this many times going forward. I am not super comfortable doing how-to videos and something I haven't done more than once. So a lot of this is just me honestly documenting what I've done with this car as I go, just to give people a reference for what I've done, and because I think it can be useful for people to kind of see where every little thing is on a car. Sometimes if you're looking for something, even myself, I'll go back and reference my video and be like, oh yeah, that's where that bolted in. That's exactly where that piece went. So stuff like that is what I find useful with this. And yes, we're going to cue the sped up video for this because that's what a lot of this is. This is just time consuming stuff where you're taking things off, you're cleaning things up, and you're sanding everything down. You know, again, you do want to get rid of that surface rust. Once again, I brought in the bolt buster, that magnetic heat induction gun. Can't recommend that enough. Got to use that one more time to take off a rusty stuck bolt. But then I just had a wire brush, and then I was taking a wire brush to everything, trying to get rid of all the biggest chunks of the rust that I could at first. So that was one of the first steps. Once I had kind of all the pieces out of the way from where I wanted to paint, I just took a wire brush to it and brushed everything off. And next I had this little multi-tool that is also a sander, and I used that to kind of sand everything that was flatter. Anything that I could get with that made it a lot easier than trying to do it all by hand. Of course, areas where anything's not super flat, you would have to kind of use your hand with a piece of sandpaper and just sand it down that way. Whatever you can do to kind of get rid of that rust and to scuff things up, because a way to get the primer and paint to stick is basically by scuffing everything up. Scuff up the old paint, scuff up the rust. You know, of course you want to remove as much of that rust as you can. And basically once you feel pretty good about all that prep work, I honestly had a couple hours just in doing this. That's one of the most important things about painting stuff is prep work. But once I had that done, I took an air gun, took some compressed air, tried to spray off everything, clean it up as best I could. I believe paint thinner for like professional shops would probably use paint thinner or something like that to, you know, clean everything off and make sure it's really good before they would actually paint it. Again, not on how to, no professional advice here, just telling you what I did. So here's a final look at the engine bay and what it looked like once I had everything prepped and basically right before I was going to go prime it. And another important step in painting, in the painting process, is just taping things off you don't want to get painted. You know, so I taped off the fenders here just a little bit. Again, this is a real amateur spray paint kind of thing going on here. But realistically, I'm just trying to prevent this rust from spreading much more than it is, and just make this engine bay look a little bit nicer, because of course it looked pretty bad before. So I just want it to look decent. And really part of painting that can be tricky too is just getting at all the angles. So with the engine out, that really gives me a chance to, as you'll see, hop in the engine bay and just get paint from all directions. So that's part of the reason I wanted to do this now as well. So I did end up putting on 2 coats of primer, and even once I put that primer on, honestly, it looked pretty good. So I did spray those 2 coats of primer. If you're doing this, I would also recommend you have some sort of mask. Again, I'm not a professional. I just kind of did this in the limited time I had, but stay safe. Do anything you need to keep yourself healthy while doing something like this, because paint is not the safest thing to always be breathing in. I did leave most of the wiring harness kind of in place, but I moved it all out of the way so that I could get a good paint in different areas, and then I just put these plastic bags on other areas I didn't want painted again as well. So after it was primed, I let the primer sit for a little while, and then I went on to the paint. And again, just like the primer, I ended up spraying on 2 coats of this paint that I picked up. It was supposed to be a paint that was more rust proofing paint, because of course that was kind of my end goal here, was to keep the rust out. So I wasn't as concerned with the color, but it was a silver rust kind of preventive paint, and that's what I sprayed on. So here it is. You can see it does look pretty nice, but of course that's another thing with paint that I've come to understand. A lot of it can look really nice when you first finish. It's just kind of a matter of how long it holds up and how well it will look that nice, as far as whether or not it's actually a good kind of paint job. But this for me is just something to clean this up now, and it didn't take much to have it look better than it did before. So just something I wanted to do by myself, since it was relatively cheap for me to do this. So that's about it for cleaning up the engine bay. Then I let it sit for basically a couple days, and then I came back and started putting everything back in place so I wouldn't make it any harder for us when we go to put the engine back in. So I put a lot of the stuff back in place that I had removed. Next, I'll just briefly touch about this. I already released a video with a teardown of the EVO 8 throttle body, and I can't preface this enough. This video was really just me tearing this down because I wanted to show everyone the components that were in it. I don't really think it even necessarily needed to be torn down, and I don't think I did everything right either, judging by the comments. So of course, please check the comments. That's part of what I like about most of you guys that watch my videos. It seems like we're all strong in the EVO community and all trying to help each other out. So there's some good comments in there about stuff, a film that I probably shouldn't have scraped off or would need to potentially respray when I put this back on. So just something to be mindful of. Always check the comments of my videos or the video description if I have updates. And the next thing I did was actually tear apart the cylinder head, and I'm gonna have a video on this coming out as well. Again, more about just documenting the process, and mostly so if you were looking for something within the cylinder head, you know, if you're looking for something specifically wrong or just want to make sure it was right, hopefully you could reference mine to kind of see if something is like drastically out of place or similar issues to that. So again, watch for this video coming out soon. I will release kind of a full teardown video of taking apart, disassembling an EVO 8 cylinder head. And while we're on the topic of the cylinder head, I do want to just talk a little bit about what I ended up buying new in this situation. I did end up getting brand new lifters. The GSC zero tick lifters is what I ended up going with. So we'll get brand new lifters in this. I ended up getting brand new keepers, also known as locks, just because those are honestly very easy to lose and were cheap enough to buy. So I got brand new locks. It's going to get brand new seals. All the valves should be being reused. The springs, retainers will also be being reused. And I am going to invest in some GSC S1 cams. I actually just found some recently, so hopefully they come in time as well. And honestly, since I don't have this video out yet, if you want to see something specific about the EVO 8 cylinder head, please let me know. I can try to make a video and show you, hopefully I filmed whatever you wanted to see, and I could, show you that clip of the cylinder head and maybe help you out. And one other thing I can tell you already that this cylinder head did need as well was new exhaust guides. They were basically out of spec, and they take on a lot more heat than the intake side, so that kind of makes sense. So we did put in all new GSC bronze exhaust guides as well. So that cylinder head is pretty much hopefully near completion, but we're still working on finishing that, which is great because that moves into the new OEM short block that actually showed up too. It took about 2 weeks to show up. I was a little disappointed, I guess, in the shipping. It's like they had this cardboard box on top of it that kind of wore through and got everything dirty, but that's okay. That's why I have Andy working on the engine, cleaning everything up, and actually as I'm recording this, he already started putting kind of the front half of the motor together, so it's pretty much ready to go and waiting for the cylinder head. What's up guys, it's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this episode we're going to take this brand new OEM 4G63 short block, put it all together, and put this engine in. Now before I jump into what we're putting back in, I'm going to go into some components that we're kind of leaving out. This is the old front oil pump case and the old balance shafts. So we are not putting these balance shafts back in. This is the front case that was basically giving me nightmares because one of the threads was stripped out where the crank position sensor was bolted on. So we got a brand new OEM front case for that. And then we also took out this single disc stock type clutch, and we're putting in a brand new ACT twin disc clutch. So here's a shot of the short block, and this is honestly after Andy probably had a couple hours into prepping this block for me. Andy from ASM is doing almost all the work on this in this episode. He's doing everything here. I'm here to help out with a little bit here and there and also film things as they're going along. But just some details for you guys. I did pick up this brand new OEM short block for about $3,100. It sounds like there's actually more in the States now than I thought. So if you guys wanted to grab one, yeah, $3,100 you can get a brand new OEM short block. Shipping is probably still going to vary from about $300 to $500, I'm guessing, depending on where you live. But it is also worth noting, I think, that this engine, again, already has some time into it. And he put the rear main seal on. He did a lot of the front casing. He did all that other stuff to put this together. When you get a brand new OEM short block, it is literally just the crank rods, pistons, and the block. Like, you're not getting much else. So you need to buy a lot of other stuff or already have it, you know, from an old engine to transfer onto the new one. So I also just released a video recently about this cylinder head teardown, and here is our cylinder head basically getting prepped. Andy worked so fast again, I wasn't able to film like everything as it was going on, but I did catch, you know, a lot of it as much as I could. So this is just getting the EVO 8 cylinder head prepped, ready to go. I found some GSC S1 cams. I bought some used ones. That's the same thing I did with my black Evo. I really like those cams. They seem to just come on really quickly. You don't lose any spool, anything like that. You just gain some top end power. So I believe they're a 268 profile, but the GSC S1s are the cams I have in both my Evos. And I also have brand new GSC zero tick lifters. We went ahead and bought a whole new set of lifters as well. And here we're gonna just put our head gasket on the block. The gasket kit I got for this was basically the OEM full gasket kit. So this is just the OEM Mitsubishi head gasket. And then of course we're just gonna set our cylinder head in place. And really, I don't think hardly anyone ever runs the stock head studs anymore. Mine did still have the stock head studs in it. And we're gonna swap those out for some ARP head studs. So Andy did most of the hard work on this again. That's going to be a common theme of this video. He did a lot of the technical work just to make this stuff go so much faster. So he was torquing down the head studs, getting everything ready with that. I spent some time getting spark plugs ready, getting the NGK spark plugs, the BPR 8 ESs, if I'm not mistaken. Gapped those down to about 20 thousandths and put those in. And of course, I do have a full cam install video, how to basically all set to go. If you want to see that video, I'm going to put a link to that in the video description down below. This video today is really all just kind of about the stuff that I've got done recently to this Evo build. And here we're basically just priming the oil pump, running some oil through the engine, and I cover this as well in my cam install video, but this is just something that's really good to do to double check, make sure the oil is coming through your lifters, coming through your rockers, and that everything's working like it should, and just of course running oil through the system before you actually are firing up the engine. And to do this, you're basically just putting a drill on the front of the oil pump and you're spinning that oil pump over, and that's picking up the oil from your oil pump pickup and then running oil, you know, through your engine. So I was trying my best to help out and keep this job moving along, so I wasn't filming every little thing here, but Andy was kind of working on putting the front of the engine together, so I got a few shots of the front of the engine stuff going together before it was kind of all together. While he was working on that, I was working on some turbo stuff. This engine actually still had the EVO 8 stock turbo, and we're going to swap in an EVO 9 stock turbo. So I was working on taking off the old lines from the old turbo and all the other components from the old turbo, while Andy was working on the front part of this engine. And it's probably worth repeating, I do have a timing belt install video as well. That's a very detailed video. So that's not being covered here today, but I will put that link in the video description as well if you're just interested in that. So here is our stock exhaust manifold, stock O2 housing, stock EVO 9 turbo. I kind of got all that stuff together, got it ready to go, and we wanted to do a bit of a test fit with this while the engine was out of the car, just to make things a lot easier. And well, test fitting, well, what would there be to test fit? Really, it's just kind of the lines. They are a bit different. The coolant and oil lines for the turbo are a bit different between the 8 and the 9. But for the most part, you can actually make them all work, minus basically that oil return line. I think this engine, or this turbo I should say, came with the car, and it came with a return line that I believe was an EVO 9 return line. So I had 2 oil return lines, and the 9 one just seemed to be angled better to fit and bolt to the oil pan. So if you were basically doing this swap and weren't sure what to buy to put an EVO 9 turbo on your EVO 8, the thing you'd for sure probably want to buy is going to be your EVO 9 J-pipe and also your EVO 9 oil return line. So here it is, bolted up, and then I just, again, checked all the lines. There's 2 coolant lines, 2 oil lines. Make sure those are going to work up and line up okay. You have to bend them around a little bit to get them to fit. And basically one of the brackets that holds, I think it was the oil feed line from the head, there's a bracket that's supposed to bolt in place. That one I couldn't get to fit, but the line itself is still going to work just fine. I may swap them out later. If you just want to make this job go easy, if you are swapping on an EVO 9 turbo, yeah, just go ahead and buy all the EVO 9 lines. And speaking of the J-pipe, I'm going to cut ahead a little bit here, of course, to the engine in the car, but this is why you want the 9 J-pipe. It's going to be shorter, not as long as the 8, and you can see that this J-pipe gets really close, basically, to that positive, electrical wire that runs to your starter. It is working. I will say that this setup is actually still currently working with the stock lower intercooler pipe, but it's just generally not recommended. I'm going to swap this one out with an EVO 9 J-pipe as soon as it comes in. So the next thing we're going to do is get our clutch bolted on. We, of course, are taking the engine off the engine stand. We're going to get it on the ground, so we need to get access to the back of the crank so we can bolt on our flywheel and our ACT twin disc clutch. If you are looking for exact detailed how-to as far as transmission prep and installing a clutch in an Evo, I already have those videos. I'll try to include links to those in the video description as well if you want exact how-tos on that. But when it comes to this ACT twin disc clutch, this is basically a brand new item, hasn't been out for very long, and I am going to do a how-to specifically on installing this clutch as well. But it's not done yet. It'll come out soon though. But here's the quick version of showing the install. Andy had a special tool to keep the flywheel from spinning over, so he put that in place, that stopper, to keep things from turning over. And of course you're going to torque on your flywheel bolts, and then you're going to torque your clutch on as well. Try to utilize the star pattern, make sure you're not putting anything on crooked. Of course, use your clutch alignment tool as well when you are installing your clutch. And I do need to say, I did, spoiler alert, I got to drive this car already with this clutch. It feels pretty awesome, especially for a daily driven car. The clutch feel is so light, and so far there's like no chatter, no noise. This thing, if you are looking for a streetable clutch that can hold some good horsepower, a good amount of torque, this one is, I think it's going to be great. I don't want to speak too soon yet because I want to see how it holds up, of course, to some launches and to actually racing. But the pedal feel is certainly a lot lighter than most any other twin disc you're going to have on the market. So if you're looking for a light pedal feel and like the lighter feel, don't want that leg workout, this twin disc clutch is basically where you're going to want to look. And of course we have our monolock collar, another great ACT item that I recommend for most anyone that is putting a clutch in their Evo. Get that ACT monolock collar in so you don't have to worry about your throw-up bearing potentially coming out of place and popping out. So once you do have your clutch bolted up, of course you do have to do some prep to your transmission. Again, I have a full video on this, very detailed on what you would need to do to prep your transmission to get it installed. So check the video links. There's going to be a lot of links in this video description here. Throw-up bearing, I am utilizing the throw-up bearing that came from ACT. So this is an ACT throw-up bearing. A lot of people love OEM. I'm not going to say don't go OEM, but this one, just for the record, we're throwing in our ACT throw-up bearing. Another thing here that Andy makes look so easy, actually lining things up, getting this transmission on. This can take a long time. If you're doing this yourself, be patient. It could take a while. Believe me, I know it can be frustrating to line things up. Just try not to force it. And of course, don't just use the bolts to pull things in, because that's probably not right. It should slide on a bit before you end up putting those bolts in place. And before you get too far along, it's a great time to pop in that throw bearing. You should feel it, you know, it should pull in place. The throw bearing is going to push into that monolock collar, and it's going to hold that shifter fork in place. So you always kind of want to do that when you're ready, and not wait too long before you get too far in the process. Because if for some reason it doesn't pop in right and you're taking that transmission off, you know, you're just making way more work for yourself if you don't check that as soon as you're ready to. All right, here we go. This is certainly another case where it's awesome to have a hoist. It makes this so much easier. I've dropped in an engine and transmission myself before on my black Evo in that build, and without using a hoist, and I didn't actually even have a transfer case at the time, and porting the transfer case in later was such a pain. So of course the first thing we did here was get the transfer case in place. We had a ratchet strap on it to pull it over to the side, kind of keep it out of the way. But it's amazing to me that if this was real-time footage, honestly, this was 20 minutes, 25 max, getting this whole engine in. It went incredibly smooth, but that's what you get when you basically work with someone that has done this before and has all the right tools. It's just really nice. And the way we ended up going about this one is basically putting the car up in the air, bringing the engine underneath, and then we brought the cherry picker back in to just kind of help us finagle things around a little bit and get it in place. There's more than one way to do this for sure. So this is not, you know, the only way to do it. You could drop the engine in from the top, of course. You could do multiple different things here, but this is just the way that worked well for us to get this engine in place. And it bears repeating, this process is just so much nicer when you have, you know, the chance to bring the car up and down with the hoist, and also the chance to bring the engine up and down with the cherry picker or engine hoist, whatever you want to call it. So that just made this go very smooth. And once the engine was pretty much in place, so we were putting in motor mounts, the transmission mount that's on the driver's side, the passenger side mount, that engine mount, put those two mounts in first. And once we kind of had the engine held in place, we brought the car back up so we could work underneath it easily, and then we got that transfer case mounted in place as well. I'm just trying to show as much as I can in this process so it could help you guys out if you're looking for certain shots, for the way certain things look. Just trying to get you a feel for how everything looked, how we put things in. Of course, you can see I took that turbo back off, the whole turbo setup, I took it back off the engine for drop-in purposes. It makes it easier to drop it in without any extra length basically on the engine or extra width. And next again, we utilized our OEM gasket, the exhaust gasket, and I put the turbo in place. It's kind of nice to drop this all in as one piece, especially when the radiator's out, all that stuff is out of the way. Kind of makes things a lot easier. It can be done with your radiator in, you just have to be a bit more careful. And fast forward to hooking up a lot of coolant lines, a lot of oil lines, a lot of plugs, you know, stuff like that, hooking everything up, putting the power steering back in place, putting a serpentine belt back on. I'm actually leaving the air conditioning pump off on this one, running the non-AC belt for this car, since mostly it won't be used in too warm of climates. And that was about it. That was all in a day's work here. Two guys, of course, working on this car, but it was still amazing to me that basically in about 7 to 8 hours, we went from a short block to an assembled long block to dropping everything in to installing a clutch. So this was just fantastic to get so far on this car in one day. I said before things were going to start moving fast, and they certainly have. The ugly and rusty Evo is running and drivable, and in this episode we'll show you how it got there. So we are back at ASM for day 2 of assembling this ugly Evo build. One of the first things we had to do was replace the driver's side front CV shaft, also known as a half shaft. Andy noticed that transmission fluid had actually filled up inside the drive shaft portion here that you're going to see. Someone actually, when they put this old one in, must have been way too hard on trying to get it in place and kind of slammed it in. You can see this little piece inside of the CV shaft. You can see the good one where it looks like there's an actual plate in there to keep the grease in where it needs to be. And on this old rusty one, it's a little hard to see, but there's basically that piece was all smashed up, so the grease wasn't being held in place like it was supposed to. Now, amazingly, like, this was kind of hard to find. CV shafts for these cars, OEM is always best. I've heard people saying the aftermarket ones always tend to leak, But when you're limited in options and on a budget, there's not a whole lot you can do. Luckily, this one, I believe, was $80 from AutoZone, and they actually had 2 of them in stock, so I have 2 of them now, just in case. Another thing I wanted to do right away was install a wideband gauge. If you've watched my wideband video that I've made in the past, you know that I preach the importance of having a wideband in a car, so you can kind of monitor things and know what's going on. It's a great safety tool to have in place. So while this car is up on the hoist, I'm just going to install that wideband O2 sensor here and run that wire up to inside the cabin for the gauge. I haven't finished this install yet to the gauge, but while I had access to putting this car on the hoist, it was definitely something I wanted to do. And the way I ran this O2 sensor wire is pretty much where the rear O2 sensor would typically go. So I ran it up and fed the wire through. This is the passenger seat, the front passenger seat, and ran the wire up through there. And then we had to bolt all the exhaust components back in place. So we got our downpipe bolted back up. And throughout this episode, I'm probably going to speak to things I wasn't able to entirely film while I was working on them or Andy was working on it. So one thing I do want to mention here is that I do have basically an oil cooler block off right now running with this engine. We decided that it wasn't worth risking the old OEM oil cooler. The main reason is that, you know, if there was bearing material in the oil pan and stuff, and if any of that gets in your oil cooler, it's pretty much impossible to wash. So I did not want to take the risk of ruining a brand new engine by installing an old oil cooler. But I will say I do have the STM kit on the way for an oil cooler, so I will be installing that in the future. Again, I did make a video on this, on changing at least the OEM oil cooler lines, and I believe I mentioned in the video that if I had to do it all over again, I would just get the STM kit or some other aftermarket kit, simply because the lines themselves, if you buy brand new OEM lines, they're like over $200 just for both lines, and you could get a whole brand new kit for about $360. So that will be coming, but for now, we're just running a block off, so we don't actually have an oil cooler in place currently, which I will say should be fine for now, but you really do just want an oil cooler on there, something to cool your oil temperatures. So then I had to install a lot of the basic setup, putting on the front mount intercooler, putting on the upper intercooler pipe, lower intercooler pipe, bolted all that stuff back on. This is a stock front mount intercooler that I picked up somewhere along the way. Somehow I have 3 of these stock front mount intercoolers now. The one that was on the car looked kind of like corroded and stuff. Again, probably, you know, rust and everything. So even though it is aluminum, I decided to throw in this other one that is a little bit more dented, but actually kind of seemed better overall. So we're running this one for now. Intercooler piping setup, I do have the engine upper intercooler pipe and the engine air intake. So this setup should work just fine for what I want to do with the car. And also right now we don't have our boost controller installed yet, so all we're doing is running wastegate pressure, and in order to do that we just run a vacuum hose direct from the J-pipe to the turbo wastegate. Again, not shown here, but that is what the current setup is. I do have a Grimspeed 3-port boost controller, so I will be hooking that up in the near future as well. But for now, a lot of this is really just about breaking this engine in, trying to drive this car a little bit, get things sorted out without making too many changes. So again, just running a stock EVO mass airflow sensor with that engine air intake pipe setup and a K&N air filter. But of course I did upgrade the blow-off valve. If you're new to EVOs, the stock EVO 8 blow-off valve is plastic and it's kind of a piece of junk, known to leak pretty easily. So this, you can run an EVO 9 or an EVO 10 is a cheap, effective upgrade to run that EVO 9 or EVO 10 blow-off valve. So I don't remember which one this is. I actually think this is the EVO 10 blow-off valve that I put in here. And yep, running that vacuum hose, connecting that back up from the blow-off valve to the intake manifold port. And then the lower intercooler pipe setup here is running stock for now because I didn't have the coupler to adapt to my other one, and I'm also waiting for that EVO 9 J-pipe. So I will be running an aftermarket lower intercooler pipe. This is definitely an area that's worth upgrading if you're looking for some cheap horsepower on your EVO. The stock lower intercooler pipe is pretty restrictive, so it's worth an investment to upgrade to an aftermarket one if you haven't already. And of course, a lot of things were plugged in, a lot of things were buttoned up, adding a lot of fluids, coolants, of course, all that kind of stuff before you end up firing it up. But it did come down to that moment of truth, that first fire up, starting up that brand new short block, starting that engine up. You know, it's a little nerve-wracking for me, of course, and not everyone might feel the same way, but, you know, before we got too far along getting everything kind of put together, we definitely wanted to fire up and make sure it was running okay. And just to give you a true glimpse of kind of how this goes, I'm going to show you this clip unedited. I'm just going to show you a bit. You know, it took a while to crank before it fired. Just kind of want to show you what the experience was like here.
Sensor, we got plug the crank sensor in. Try it again. Try it again. Keep doing it again. Back down.
So yeah, it ran. It sounded good. There was a little tingy like noise that I heard on higher acceleration that kind of freaked me out at first, but we're fairly certain it's just something with the exhaust. The exhaust has this weird kind of rattle that happens at higher RPMs right now. And honestly, once I took this car out on the road, I didn't even notice it at all. So I think we're good, but you know, fingers crossed. I'm certainly not saying 100% that everything's fine yet. We need to certainly do a bit more with this car to make sure. So of course, now I'm just bolting on a few more of the front end parts, getting that actual front bumper in place, along with each headlight. And I also wanted to kind of update. I know if you watched my video about tearing down the EVO Throttle Body, people had mentioned about how I removed some film and some coating that would make it idle incorrectly, or perhaps not idle at all. I will say we were able to successfully start this car. It runs, it idles just fine. We did some adjustments with the BIS screw, but it did not seem to be a huge issue. So just kind of an update on that. If you did happen to clean your throttle body similar to the way I did, it shouldn't like totally make it undrivable or anything, but I can follow up with that again as well once I get a bit more into this car. So yep, installing more parts. We got the whole front end of the car back together. And then one other thing I really wanted to do was change these front struts, because these front struts were so rusty. They were literally pretty much falling in on themselves. The tire was starting to rub because there was so much rust and these were so bad. So I had a used set of OEM suspension that I'm going to swap in the front and the rear, but all I had time to do for this one was swap in the front. And I'm only going to show you one side, but of course I did both sides. And here's the comparison between the old one. Have you seen such rust? Like, especially in an Evo. It's amazingly sad to me that it got so bad. But at least a part like that can be easily swapped out. I am pretty confident in the front half of this car, at least as of right now, as far as rust stuff goes. Having cleaned up the engine bay, having swapped this suspension, and looking at that actual like lower front cross member and stuff, it's all relatively solid up there. I wouldn't want to have to remove it at this point, because that would probably be a nightmare. But I'm not, concerned about it falling apart. Can't say the same for the rear quite yet, but we'll tackle that when we get to it. So once we had the front end back together, had that front suspension swapped out, started it up, let it run a little bit more, made sure it shifted through all the gears. I do have to say it does shift through all the gears. The transmission seems okay, even though it was a big unknown. Thought about having it rebuilt while it was out, but just in the time frame we had, just wanting to get this car up and running and didn't really want to add another variable to everything. We just decided to put the transmission back in. And it does shift fine, but the shifter itself, and I'm chalking it up to the shifter linkage because it does look really rusty. It's just very tight. You know how typically when you let go of the shifter and bring it to neutral, it just kind of settles in neutral? This shifter does not want to settle. Like if you're shifting 1 to 2, and then you're going to go to 3, you need to make sure you move the shifter over to the right before you go into 3, because it never wants to settle back towards the middle. So that's what I'll be working on next. That's one of the most important things I'm going to be working on, actually, is making sure this thing can shift right. I ordered a whole bunch of shifter parts, OEM stuff. I ordered some Torque Solutions shifter bushings, but then any other OEM part I could get for shifter linkage, I ordered that as well. So I'll be doing that pretty soon. So here it is. It is a running car. So we're going to do a little walk around and show you what it sounds like. I will say I'm super glad if you heard those cams. I love the sound on the Evo with the lopey cam, and I'm surprised these GSC S1s actually have such a lope to them. It's pretty cool. And even on this exhaust is pretty quiet overall. So I took it up and down the road, made sure it was drivable, and it again seemed to drive relatively well, but there's still plenty to do. There's a lot to do on this car. Plans coming up, if everything is going well enough like we want it to, we're going to swap in some 1200cc injectors, and we're going to switch over to E85. But of course, as I mentioned, I got to check that shifter linkage out first. I got to swap out a J-pipe yet. I got to install an oil cooler yet. So there's a lot of things that are going to be coming up. And hey, 20 feet away, walking around this car, it almost looks like a relatively normal Evo, even though it is probably one of the rustiest Evos you'll ever see. In this episode of the Ugly Evo Build blog, we're going to take a look at fixing our sticky shifter, changing out our lower intercooler pipe, and along with that, our J-pipe. And by the end of the video, I'll share some bad news for me that might be some good news for you. So we're back at ASM, and I'm working on the Ugly Evo build. So the shifter was very sticky, and I bought these Torque Solution shifter cable bushings, thinking they would help fix the issue. I did install the shifter bushings, and I will do a full how-to video on that coming out soon. But for now, I just want to say the main issue with my shifter is that it was not returning to neutral. Basically, it would not ever want to center itself. And spoiler alert, the shifter bushings were not the main issue, but I'm still glad I changed them. So of course, to get to these shifter bushings, I had to remove my battery, then remove my battery tray, and then I could actually see my shifter linkage that bolts to the transmission and these shifter bushings. No surprise, things are a little rusty here, again, of course. But what you're seeing is me actually shifting side to side. This is what it looks like when you're shifting side to side. And the piece where you see the little blue, that piece is where two shifter arm linkage pieces basically meet. And that was actually the main issue. This will be potentially your main issue too if you're having a similar problem. So of course, I just popped off the shifter linkage and then prematurely actually removed this bolt, or this nut I should say. Didn't have to remove this nut yet because I couldn't actually separate this arm. So if you're doing this job, you don't need to remove this nut quite yet. But again, this is the source of the issue right here. So there's a flat washer, a lock washer, and a nut holding that on. And then there are two bolts that actually hold this arm to the transmission. And you need to take note, I guess, of that little white clip that goes underneath that other shifter arm piece as well. We're going to talk more about that later in the video too. But I removed those two bolts that were holding this arm in, and then I could remove this arm assembly. And no surprise, it was tight. It was hard to move. It did move, but it was hard to move. And luckily, now that it's out of the car, we can show it to you a little bit better, and you can see. This was actually after I pried on it for quite a while. I was able to separate it, made it look easy here, but I had to put it in a vise and then pull it apart that way. But this was my main issue here. Of course, I'm still glad I changed my shifter bushings because they were also kind of seized in place and weren't spinning like they should. But the main reason my shifter felt so stiff and wouldn't want to return basically to that center natural position was because of this shifter linkage portion right here. It pretty much just ended up getting rusty over time, so I cleaned it up with some sandpaper, made sure it would rotate well on there, and then added some grease and put it back together. So hopefully great news for you guys. If you're having an issue like this, it really shouldn't cost you anything but your time. for the most part to get this fixed. You don't need to buy the torque solution shifter bushings or any other shifter bushings. However, while you're in there, as you can see here, these are seized in place. They should be able to spin, and they don't. So be ready to destroy your old bushings to actually get them off, because it can be very hard to get any grip on that part of the bushing to actually spin it with that rubber around it. So I basically ended up, cutting away that old rubber. And then, as you can see here, I'm actually utilizing my heat gun, putting some heat to it, and then putting a vice grip on it to actually get that old part of that bushing loose. I did do something similar with the other one that was still on the car. I wasn't able to take that arm off completely, or I decided not to take that other arm off completely. But for the other larger shifter bushing, I will just say I was able to, after spending about a half hour cutting away that old bushing and then prying on it, I was able to get that one off without any heat. And for a Rusty EVO with 200,000 miles, if I can get mine off without any heat, hopefully you could on your car as well. And here we are just showing those torque solution shifter bushings on that shaft, and they should be able to spin around freely. And of course, this isn't a full how-to, just showing you that I put things back together and that it did shift quite a bit better after I made this change. So of course I did some testing once I put it back in, and it did definitely shift a lot better. It took a little bit, it still was kind of slowly moving more towards that centering position, but as you can see, it's a lot better than it was before, and it seemed more normal, more like it should. But one thing I did want to point out, as I was talking to someone on Instagram about this, you can see that white piece basically that sits there, that little white plastic clip. It does seem like it has a very loose tolerance to it. So I do want to give a shout out to project_Evo_. I talked to him on Instagram, and he actually informed me of a new part that I didn't even know was out there, that it seems like it would be a good piece from Ross Sport. It seems like just a tighter piece to actually hold around there to keep it from having so much slop. So if I would have known about this piece ahead of time, I would have ordered it and changed it out. I may still change this out in the future, but just giving you guys a heads up. Moving on, the next thing I did was ended up changing out that lower intercooler pipe and that turbo J pipe. So of course, to do this more easily, I took off the front bumper cover, and now I'm just showing you that weird crazy design of that stock lower intercooler pipe. And we're gonna do just a quick edit, snap of the fingers, and here we go. This is the better one. This is an aftermarket lower intercooler pipe that we swapped on. Once I had the right coupler, I was also missing a coupler, a reducer coupler, to go from the J pipe to this lower intercooler pipe, so I had to purchase that as well. But I got this swapped out, and here you can see the wonky design. I don't know about you, but I think one of them would flow much better than the other. And because I mentioned it in my previous video but didn't actually show it, this blue hose here is just running from the J-pipe nipple, running that vacuum hose directly to the wastegate, the internal wastegate. And what that's going to do is just limit our boost to whatever the spring is within that internal wastegate, which I believe is, I think, like 10 psi. And here's just a comparison shot of the two J-pipes. The one on the left, the longer one, is an EVO 8 J-pipe, and the one on the right is the EVO 9 J-pipe. You can still buy the EVO 9 J-pipe brand new from OEM Mitsubishi parts dealers, so I recommend doing that if you need to. And here's why, of course. It doesn't look like as much space right now, but this is the EVO 9 J-pipe, and here we cut to the EVO 8 J-pipe on the EVO 9 Turbo. It's so tight, it's very close to your starter. I definitely recommend, if you're putting an EVO 9 Turbo on, you're going to want that EVO 9 J-pipe. You can see how much more clearance there is, how much better of a fit there is. So since the engine did have a couple heat cycles on it and driven a couple miles, we decided to change the engine oil, get rid of that break-in oil, and then I took it for a test drive, and I got to fill it up. I put gas in it. Hooray, exciting, fun times. Until I got about 4 gallons in, and it was leaking. So it's leaking out the top where basically the fuel pump assembly bolts in, and of course it's rusty. And most of you know I have a JDM, brand new JDM gas tank that is kind of ready to go in, but I did not want to tackle that job yet. There's a spectator race coming up soon in basically about a week or so that I wanted to do that I don't think I'm going to be able to do now if I need to replace this fuel tank, because I don't know if I'm going to have time to do that. But good news for you guys, I do plan to film it. I do want to figure out for sure that this JDM fuel tank will work. So that is next on my list, trying to get this fuel tank swapped out. So there is still quite a bit to do. When a car like this is kind of sat for so long, it's one thing to have it actually driving up and down the road. It's another thing to really consider it fully drivable. Welcome back to the Ugly Evo Build Blog series. In this video, we're going to put some street miles on the Evo, take it for a little bit of a road trip. We're going to also show you a comparison of a US market gas tank to this brand new JDM gas tank. And along with that, we're going to go underneath the car and show you some work we did not only to drop the tank, but to clean up this rust a little bit. And finally, we're going to get to test fit that JDM tank and let you know how that goes. So this day did start off at Andy's shop, that's ASM, and the car started off there, and I got to give it one quick look over before we brought it to a track. Luckily, they were doing a driver's ed test day at a local track nearby, so it seemed like a perfect opportunity to test out the car a little bit, throw it around a little bit on the track just to make sure nothing would like completely fall apart, because if it was going to break, we wanted it to happen at this track close by, that's closer to Andy's shop, as opposed to driving it about 100 miles, which is what I did end up doing. Took it for a road trip and drove it to my parents' house so I could start working on it there with the project that I knew would take a bit longer and basically hold up a hoist for a longer amount of time, and that's of course dropping that fuel tank. And the car handled just fine. Took it out for a couple spins and it did fine, but of course it was leaking a little bit of fuel out of the top of the gas tank, so I was glad I could keep my windows down so I could still breathe. Next was basically my inaugural trip with this car. I got to drive it, like I said, about 100 miles, and it rode just fine going down the road. I actually really like this HKS exhaust as far as streetability goes. It's super quiet. It's actually really kind of nice to have it so quiet, and the stock suspension is kind of tough to beat when it comes to being a comfortable ride. So it was kind of a pretty smooth, uneventful drive. And once I made it to my dad's shop, I was able to get the car up on the hoist and start taking a look at this job, which I've said before and I'll say it again, is one of the worst jobs I think that you can do on an Evo. Changing the fuel tank is just awful. It's a pain. You cannot drop the fuel tank basically without removing part of the lower subframe that holds your rear differential in place. And we'll get more into that later in the video, but just saying that right up front, this is one of the worst jobs. And I went into it with that mindset. I was like, this is going to be awful, and it still was awful. Usually if you try to set yourself up and say this is going to be really bad, sometimes it's not as bad, but we'll keep walking through this. I do plan to do a full how-to, more detailed how-to on this later, but for now I'm just trying to keep my blog series updated. And of course, when you're doing something like this, one of the first things you want to do is disconnect your positive battery terminal. Make sure you're not going to potentially arc anything, so just disconnect your positive battery terminal before you're doing any big job on your car. And now we're underneath the car, and yeah, you can see it's pretty rusty, and there's a lot of stuff we have to remove. We end up, removing our drive shaft. We're going to remove our exhaust. But yeah, this is what it looks like. This is what the fuel tank looks like underneath the car before we start dropping anything out. And the first thing I did was remove this midsection of my exhaust. Eventually, I actually ended up removing the rear actual muffler, the rear portion of the exhaust as well. And I cannot say this enough, but this bolt buster, this magnetic heat induction heater thing has been amazing. I think I would have thrown this car away by now if I didn't have this. I think it saved me so many broken bolts. So anytime you can get on the nut side, basically, of any nut bolt combo, it works. It just heats it up very well, and you can actually get things loose without breaking them. So I utilize that on my drive shaft bolts, the 4 drive shaft bolts that hold it in to the rear diff. And then of course I just unbolted the 4 nuts that hold that drive shaft in place and removed my drive shaft. Thumbs up if this is the rustiest Evo you think you've ever seen. Good news for you guys though, if I can do this on this rusty ass car, you guys should be able to do it on yours, at least maybe a little bit easier. Right now I'm on the passenger side of the car, just showing a little bit of where things go. The e-brake cables on both sides of these can actually end up being a pain, so just a heads up on that. When you're dropping your tank, the e-brake cables typically get in the way. And there are 4 bolts. There are not like gas tank straps that hold your gas tank in place. There are just 4 studs with bolts going to them, or I should say nuts. So there are 4 nuts that hold your fuel tank in place. So I basically started working on those first, making sure I could get them free without having them break. Of course, I did not want to break those studs since they're basically attached to the chassis of the car. So I took my time, heated them up very cautiously, of course, because anytime you're around fuel, you got to be careful with heat or flames. And another reason I like having this magnetic heat induction tool is it doesn't create any flames. It's just kind of heating up a very specific area. Next, I am showing, this is the trickiest one right here. This is the driver's side rear of the tank. This is really the one that kind of, it seems to be the most pinched, and one of the main reasons you cannot actually drop your fuel tank just by releasing these nuts and taking these nuts off, because these studs are long enough and the part of the fuel tank pinch, where it pinches together, is just, it won't come out. And I'm going to show you that a little bit better soon as well. So now I'm just on the passenger side, removing that bolt, or that nut again, I should say, and getting that one loose as well. So I really did try to actually get this without removing or lowering that piece, that subframe piece that holds the rear diff in, and it's really not possible. So next I just lowered the car down and then took a look at what we could see from inside the car, our fuel pump assembly units, and I removed all the lines here. If you are actually dropping your tank, you don't actually have to remove the lines quite yet, at least at this spot. Realistically, what you need to do here is end up unplugging anything electrical, because that's a connection there that you're going to have to unplug when you're dropping your tank. But then the actual spot where you need to disconnect your fuel pressure hose and your fuel return line, that's actually on the driver's side of the car, underneath the car on the driver's side. So luckily, again, I got most of this free and out without breaking. That's another thing that's amazing to me with this whole job in a way that I've done so far. It actually went fairly well as far as how things could have gone with as rusty as things are and with things potentially breaking. It went fairly well, and honestly, it still took me 6 hours to drop this fuel tank. And here we are on the driver's side of the car. Yep, we're just removing the fuel pump assembly stuff. Again, I did not have to unplug these lines here. I could have left them plugged in if I was just dropping the tank, but I just removed them anyway. And honestly, I kind of forgot that I didn't have to remove them yet, but they would have had to come loose eventually either way since I'm swapping everything over. So back up into the air we go, and as I mentioned, what you really do need to disconnect is this area that I'm going to show here. This is on the driver's side. I know it's a little hard to reference where this is, but this is the driver's side front of the fuel tank. And this is where the lines connect that go from your fuel pump sending unit basically to the hard lines of your car that run up front. So these are the lines you for sure will have to disconnect to drop your fuel tank. And yeah, thumbs up the video if this is the rustiest Evo you've ever seen. And of course, sped up footage, and as I mentioned, this took me about 6 hours to do because of the combination of rusty bolts and taking my time and just trying to see how I could get this out. But yeah, just I was playing with this, trying to loosen up different bolts, trying to do different things to get this fuel tank to drop out. But now I'm actually going to go in and show you specifically why this tank cannot drop out without removing the portion that holds the rear diff in. So this is the driver's side rear of the tank, and as you can see, I'm pointing to, there's a piece of the tank that's basically pinched above this bar, this aluminum bar that holds the rear diff in. A piece of the gas tank is basically stuck between that stud. I'm going to show you on this new tank here, this piece is in between that stud and that bar that holds the rear diff in. So this gas tank, this fuel tank, is not coming out until you lower that bar enough to get that pinched part of the fuel tank underneath basically that stud. And one other huge pain with this job is actually the fuel fill part. As you can see here, again, thumbs up, rustiest Evo in the world. It runs this way up to the tank, and now I cut ahead to where I dropped the tank a bit, and you can see in this side part where that connects. Now, the way I actually ended up getting to it is by dropping the tank in the front as much as I could, and then basically I'm shining a flashlight in right here where you can see, and then I stuck my hand up in there and used some sockets, extensions, and ended up basically breaking that clamp that holds that on, and then spending a good half hour trying to get that hose free, because it's very hard to actually get in there to get your hand on it to pull it free. But now we've cut ahead to where I actually lowered down my rear diff. I didn't actually have to remove it, lower the rear diff from this bar, but I don't know, I did that anyway. But the bar that holds the rear diff in, that's what you need to lower down. So we've cut to the gas tank actually removed from the car. And here you can see that that bar is actually a little bit, you know, lower, drop down from the chassis of the car. And that's what you have to do to basically get your fuel tank out. And there's the bigger nut I'm pointing to now. There's a bracket, that support bracket that kind of goes there, and then one bolt that goes in as well. So that same setup is on the other side too. So basically you're gonna have to remove at least those 2 bolts on each side, and then that one nut on each side, and then you should be able to lower down that part that holds in your rear diff, and then you can get your fuel tank out, hopefully. But that is why this is one of the worst jobs. I mean, it's tough, and especially without a hoist. I do not recommend trying this if you do not have access to a hoist. Doing this on the ground is awful. Ask me how I know. So now we cut back, the fuel tank is still in the car, and this is actually on the passenger side, but I'm just showing you again basically the rear part of the fuel tank and how it's stuck with that bar and how it's not going to be able to come out unless we lower this down. And now I am running through trying to get this to clear the tank. The front of the tank needs to clear the e-brake stuff, and that's just, I don't even have good advice for that right now, just other than that's something you need to watch for when you're dropping your fuel tank. Those stupid e-brake cables are kind of right in the way, so you have to try to get those around your fuel lines. Actually, what I ended up doing, since I did remove the fuel lines from the top of the tank, or release them from where they connect to that fuel pump housing, I think what I ended up doing is basically removing that whole piece, and it was honestly so rusty, it was coming loose anyway on a bracket that held it to the tank, that I kind of removed that whole piece to get it around the actual e-brake cable. And I leave a lot of this footage in just to show you guys that it takes a long time. I spent a long time. As you can tell now, it's actually got quite a bit darker. I've spent a lot of time doing this. There's actually a lot of stuff I didn't end up filming because it was just me like messing around that I knew wasn't worth filming. So a lot of time involved in this project, especially if your car is as rusty as mine. Thumbs up if this is the rustiest Evo you've ever seen. But we did finally reach that point, luckily with a little help from my dad. It was good to have another person there to help out. We did get the tank dropped. One final thing I had to do was disconnect. There was an electrical line, a wire that runs just in front of the passenger side of the tank. I had to make sure that kind of was out of the way, and that's actually just another tight spot when you're putting the fuel tank in. Didn't show it as well here. Electrical harness, basically, had to get that out of the way and make sure it wouldn't damage it while I drop the fuel tank. But success, the fuel tank is finally out. That's one of the biggest reliefs, getting this stupid thing out of the car. It's awful. And after that long day, I just decided to call it a night and go to bed so we could get some better lighting for in the morning, and I can show you cleaning up, of course. If you are actually putting your same fuel tank back in and it's anywhere near as rusty as mine, even if it's not, you would want to vacuum everything out, clean out any potential debris that would fall into your fuel tank if you're putting your fuel tank back in. So I took a shop vac, cleaned up as much stuff as I could, just for the sake of cleaning it up. Of course, I don't really plan on using this fuel tank again, even though technically it didn't leak. The tank itself, it was only leaking because those studs were broken that hold that fuel pump assembly down, and you used self-tappers to hold that in place, which obviously didn't work very well. So the fuel tank itself, as crazy as it is, there's probably been worse Evo fuel tanks than this one. So I don't know what I'll do with it yet, but of course, when I was dropping it, I just assumed it, it's probably going to start rusting out somewhere soon. And honestly, when I looked inside it, it looked a little bit crappy too. So glad I'm swapping it out. I'm glad I'm actually able to kind of test this JDM fuel tank and make sure it can work. Of course, I'm not 100% sure yet it's going to work, but we're going to keep diving along into it. Had some cats helping me out here as I removed all the components. What I wanted to do now is really just test fit everything, just make sure all this stuff was interchangeable. I didn't really think, like anything would be too different where one piece wouldn't bolt from one tank to the another. But of course, wanted to make sure. So I started unbolting everything that I needed to swap over and then did my transfer. And part of that transfer was checking over the fuel pump assembly. This was supposed to have a Walbro 255 pump in it, so I did want to confirm that. And so I did take that whole assembly piece out, and it thankfully did have the 255 pump, which is great to see. And luckily too, he did put that new fuel filter slash sock on there because it looked pretty crappy. So it was doing its job. I'm going to put a new filter on there. I think that might be part of just having this rusty tank, or putting self-tapping screws into the top assembly and then putting rust into the fuel. I'm not really sure. So either way, while it's out, we're going to try to do it as good as we can to get it back together. So of course that portion was on the driver's side of the car, and now we're on the passenger side of the car with this fuel sending unit, I believe, as they call it. From what I understand, I think this is just a way for the fuel tank to probably work better to pick up fuel from both sides of the car. There's a line that runs from the top of this one to that fuel sending unit, probably because this tank has, you know, that spot in the middle where it needs to make room for the drive shaft. I wanted to order this piece brand new. I tried and I couldn't find it. People said they had it in stock, but no one did. So I did find a new gasket for this though, and I've actually done a video in the past changing this specific gasket itself just for this piece. So I'm at least going to put in a new gasket, if not this whole unit. If one of my viewers has one that's in better shape than mine, that's less rusty and less likely to leak, and wants to potentially sell it, I guess let me know. Maybe if I can throw it in before my next video, I would. But yeah, just speaking to Evo parts being rare, or kind of just getting harder to find because parts are getting discontinued. Right here's one of them. Next we move on to this piece that's actually at the very top of the fuel tank. This is some sort of safety valve, from what I understand, kind of just like a vent portion, and it actually, I believe, goes to the hose that from it goes to the like evap canister towards the rear of the car. This line, being totally honest with you, this line was already so rusty it wasn't even really connecting to anything. So my main priority here, you know, of course I'd like to get that reconnected. I probably will. But my main priority here is just making sure this portion isn't going to leak. So I ordered this new piece. It was only about 40 bucks for the OEM new piece. So I ordered a brand new one just because this is obviously a tough spot to get to. And I want to make sure that the fuel isn't going to leak, that there isn't going to be any leaking here. So we'll wait for that one to come in. And then hopefully I'll update you guys on that as well. And I already mentioned it, and I've done a full fuel pump install video in the past, but I did have to, you know, to be able to check what pump was in this fuel pump housing, I had to pop off this little clip that holds it in place and then pull the pump out just to verify that it was a Walbro 255 pump. And while I'm showing that, if you're looking to the left, here, these lines, these fuel lines, are the ones that basically run from the top of the tank down to the hard lines that you connect that run the fuel up front. So another thing, I tried to order some of these just because they actually showed they were in stock, those lines, but nope, they weren't in stock. So another piece that's going to be hard to find in the future, I believe. So yeah, just verifying the Walbro 255 pump was installed. And next we began transferring pieces over. Again, I just wanted to test fit things, and actually I wanted to put this whole tank in, even though I knew I was dropping it back down again because I didn't have all the pieces I wanted quite yet. But I just figured I would get it as close as I could, you know, to what it will be like when it's all done as far as putting everything together. So I put all the pieces in. That top safety valve thing that I mentioned that I'm ordering new, this old one was one of the portions that was kind of really rusty. Like the bolts on top are 8mm, but I honestly thought it needed to be like a 10mm because they were so rusted and puffed out that's just how rusty they were. They expanded so much with the corrosion. So I think it was because of the rust, but those bolt holes didn't line up quite right. But I'll touch more on that when I get actual in-depth into this fuel tank. I'm going to do a whole in-depth video hopefully about the fuel tank swap later. And one final tip that I just wanted to note is that there is a little marker, an indent portion here to line up this ring that holds your fuel pump housing assembly down. I never really noticed that before until now, but yeah, that is there because these bolts are not spaced out evenly, so there's only one way that that's going to fit on. So swapping everything over, like I said, we're gonna just put a couple nuts on to hold these in place. I need more of those nuts as well since a lot of them were broken. So I ordered some brand new OEM nuts to hold everything down as well. One of the larger differences in this tank, as I mentioned, if you saw my Instagram, is the JDM tank does not have a spot for the fuel temp sensor. We'll dig into that later, but from what I've heard, we can hopefully make that work. And then also, as you're seeing right now, there is a portion where the fill tube is. There's that smaller pipe next to it. The size of that pipe is actually smaller on this JDM tank than the US tank. So we're going to have to make an adapter to make that fit. That's also one other change that we're going to be looking into. Again, I plan to make a fully more detailed video just about the fuel tank in the future. And that's it. I'll spare you the video of me struggling to get this in, but yeah, the fuel tank was in. I put it in. It fit just fine as far as I could tell. Everything seemed good. The biggest hurdle, I think, is really just going to be, as I mentioned, that fuel temp sensor not being there, if that can be fine. And also connecting that kind of fill tube hose, that smaller portion of that fill tube hose, like breather part, that we'll need to make something to make that fit as well. If anyone is super familiar with the JDM tank or the JDM cars and could tell me if the JDM EVOs use a fuel temp sensor at all, like is it somewhere else in the car? I don't know, I'm trying to figure this out myself. And finally, as you can see here, I just had to take a wire wheel, spend a lot of time off camera again, trying to clean up as much rust as I could, trying to get rid of the surface rust, of course, just in an effort to prevent that surface rust from spreading. This is by no means a fix for some of the rust issues I have. Honestly, we'll probably get into this later, but there are some issues that are really bad. Like some spots, this one spot in particular, I'll show you guys eventually. I basically need a new chassis leg that I'm going to have to cut out metal, put in new metal because the metal is so far gone. But for now, I feel like this car, you know, an Evo in general is so over-engineered. There's a lot of mounting spots back here where I'm not super concerned about like safety, but of course I'm keeping an eye on everything. So that's about it. That's all in a couple days work of trying to keep this Evo alive and get it going and have some fun, hopefully racing it. Of course, the main thing I want to do with this car is spectator race it on a dirt track since it looks, you know, ugly and rusty anyway. And also I'll drive it in the winter a little bit and take it out ice racing. So that is my plan for this vehicle. Welcome to this episode of the Ugly Evo Build blog. In this video, we are going to take a look at installing an aftermarket oil cooler. We're going to crush our blow-off valve so it can hold a bit more pressure. We're going to install an STM O2 eliminator downpipe. And we're also going to swap out the rear shocks and a rear lower control arm bushing. Oh, and yeah, we finally make our way to the dirt track for a little racing. So we're going to start with some quick hits, some minor things that we did to the Rusty EVO build here. The first thing, we just had our strut tower bar powder coated, and so we reinstalled our strut tower bar. I waited to do that before we had the injectors installed because I knew I'd remove it anyway to get to the fuel injectors once we had installed those 1200cc high Z injectors. Next, because it seemed like a good idea, I crushed the blow-off valve so it would hold a bit more pressure. Crushing the blow-off valve is basically just kind of where you put it in a vise, and as you can see, the one on the left here is shrunk down a little bit more. It's pushed down a bit. That tightens up that spring, and that makes sure your blow-off valve doesn't start leaking at you know, certain higher pressure, since we're running about 27 psi on this Evo 9 turbo. And then I had to steal the battery tie down from my red Evo. That's why you can see the red tie down here. Until a different one showed up. I found a used tie down kit on eBay, so I bought that for like 25 bucks. But then I was surprised to learn you could buy brand new from STM. STM did have a brand new tie down stuff that you could buy for honestly like the same price or cheaper. So I do have a brand new one in stock now, kind of ready to go, but I picked up this used one as well, and it's actually just fine for this ugly Evo build here. But we need that battery tie down to do racing. I definitely wanted that battery securely tied down for any you know, type of racing I was going to do. Another quick item, I finally got to reinstalling the rear seats. They were out of the car for quite some time, so I just did some quick vacuuming, and then I had a little help from my daughter. She was helping me out put the seats back in place. I have a full how-to video on swapping EVO interior when I actually took it out of this car and put the original interior from this car into my black EVO. So if you want to check that out, that's on my channel as well for swapping in the interior. But as I mentioned, I just swapped, put back in the rear seats because they had been out for quite some time. Honestly, just because I had so many parts just rolling around here in the car and needed room basically for that gas tank. So once all that gas tank situation was figured out, got to put the back seats in, had my daughter helping me out. She wanted to get things back in so she could go for a ride. So yeah, she helped put the back seat back in, and then we installed her Recaro racing seat as well. So we got that back in and she got to go for a little ride. She does like this EVO better than the black EVO because it's quieter. Next, I went back to my dad's shop so I could swap out a lower control arm bushing and the rear shocks. Now you might ask, well, how did I know it needed a lower control arm bushing? Or a general tip here actually for anyone trying to diagnose a bad suspension component, if you got a weird noise when you hit bumps or something like that, basically if you get your car off the ground and then you kind of shake the wheel up and down or side to side, shake might not be the right word, but you want to move, you want to hold your hands on each side of the wheel and just try to move it, you know, in and out, forward and back, up and down. And when you're doing that, what you're going to do is you want to look for what might be moving. You want to look for the piece that could be, that's basically has too much slop or too much play in it. And in this case, you can definitely see that it's this rear lower control arm bushing, the innermost part where it connects. You can see it moves way more than it should, and you can hear it as well. So since these shocks that were in this car were so rusty and I did not trust them, I was going to swap them out with other OEM shocks. And while I was in there, it seemed like a perfect time to, of course, swap out that bushing as well. We get out the old trusty bolt buster. We're going to heat up all these nuts and bolts to remove the nuts and bolts that we need to get out of the way here. A tip for this, if you're doing it, is you kind of just want to do one side at a time. I didn't follow my own rules here. I dropped both of these at the same time. You end up fighting yourself a little bit if you are just trying to change your rear shocks if you drop both of them at the same time. So I would suggest doing one at a time if you happen to be swapping out the shocks in your EVO. Just drop one side at a time. Otherwise, you may have to disconnect your rear sway bar, because basically connecting those two together and then dropping both shocks at the same time kind of puts extra pressure on there, and it makes it harder to get your shocks back in place, as we'll actually see a little bit later. So luckily, again, as rusty as this car was, not a lot of issues actually getting these bolts out, and it was great that things went pretty smooth with this job. It's nice to see that gas tank in place. That looks nice, fresh JDM tank up there. But of course, the car is a little bit rusty and hasn't been serviced probably for a while, so things were a little bit sticky and a little bit tough to get out of place. So the side with the bushing that needed to be replaced was the passenger side of the vehicle. Everything else seemed good enough for this car, but now I am on the driver's side of the vehicle because I'm swapping out both rear shocks. So again, I dropped both arms at the same time here. And now we're back to the passenger side. It would have been easier to remove the muffler probably to get in here, but I was able to sneak in with a punch to knock this bolt out. It was rather seized in there a bit, so I definitely needed a punch to get it out. But it came out okay, and hopefully that's good news for you guys, because, you know, if mine came out fine, hopefully it should be the same on your car, because yours can't be rustier than mine. Then I had to utilize a hammer a little bit to knock this free and get it out of place. I didn't film the actual install of this bushing because it requires a lot of hands, and it's just a little bit tricky kind of to do, but you do need a press to press in this bushing. But if you did want to just reference this number, I do have the new bushing here on screen and the part number that you can see. So if you were looking to change this bushing on your EVO, there you go, you got that information. Again, to change it though, you will need access to a press. I just have a photo here of when I pressed out the old one before I put the new one in. It went fairly smooth, but I do have a little bit of experience doing these, you know, jobs before, so I think that helped. But again, not a full how-to on that, and just kind of giving you details, a little bit more detail about what you would need to expect if you were going to jump into that. So once we swapped that bushing out, I was able to dive back into these old shocks, and as you can see, they are really, really rusty. So we pulled out our old rusty shocks and put in some used OEM shocks, put those in place. They're going to work great for what I want. I don't really want coilovers for this or anything, because I want something that's going to give me some good travel, and I want something that's a comfortable ride. And actually, these have been great. It's definitely one of those things where it kind of spoils me when I go from one Evo to the other. This Evo just rides very nice. Stock suspension is tough to beat for just daily driving, actually. But of course, I love the look of my black Evo better when it's lowered. So again, after we changed that bushing in that lower control arm, we just put that lower control arm in place. And this is where it again got a little bit tricky. Because I had both lower control arms loosened, it was harder to get it up in place than it should have been, I guess, basically. The trick to it for me basically ended up being to put a socket and a ratchet on the sway bar link itself, and then utilize that to get a little more pressure and lift to get it to lift it up in place. But of course, it was great to have a hoist for this. You could go up and down, lower it up a bit, and just makes everything easier to work on. So I was glad I could do that. I also didn't entirely film this stuff as much as a how-to, because I was on a time crunch again, because I honestly did this like a month ago from the time I'm filming this voiceover, because I wanted to switch these shocks out before the first time I did it spectator racing, because I wasn't feeling very good about the ones that were on there to take it out on a dirt track. So you can just kind of see where I did have that ratchet on the sway bar link and got to utilize that to kind of get those bolts lined up and get everything in place. Next, we're going to jump into what I'm going to call tips for installing an aftermarket oil cooler. This is a B&M oil cooler. It's basically the STM kit that you would buy. It's like 300 some bucks. And if you've watched any of my other videos, my how-to videos, especially the one about changing the OEM oil cooler lines, I had made a comment in there that if I had to do it all over again, I would probably just buy an aftermarket cooler because it was basically the same price. But now I kind of see why it was nice to do it the way I did it and just buy the OEM lines, because when you buy this kit, you are literally like creating the lines and you're making this whole thing yourself. And there are no real directions online for how to install this aftermarket oil cooler, which I found interesting. And I guess the reason for it, I think, is because people don't really want to tell you specifically what you should do, because maybe they don't know for sure, or they don't want to be liable for telling you what to do. I'm not really sure. But good news for you guys is I have some tips for you with things that I did with my oil cooler install. Of course, first thing you want to do is remove your front bumper so you could get to where this oil cooler goes. And then the STM kit, I bought the bracket that comes with the STM kit, and I didn't like it. It just like bolts in one spot. It makes it so that the hoses would kind of point down, as you can see here. And it just seemed, I didn't like only having one mounting point, is basically what it came down to. But here's how you can, this is a mock-up. I did quite a few mock-ups in this process. So here's how you can see what it would look like if you utilize that bracket. I'm sure people have used it and it's worked fine. But again, I plan on being on a dirt track doing ice racing and stuff. So I really wanted to make sure this was secure in place. So I felt like this bracket with one mounting point wasn't going to really cut it for me. Maybe I missed something. If someone else is running this bracket and another one that works well, let me know what worked for you. But here's a mock-up of what I did with the OEM oil cooler brackets. I basically ended up modifying them to fit. This was just another test fit. As you can see right now, I have the lines kind of running towards the outside of the car. I did not end up running this specific way, but I was trying to figure out how I could utilize these OEM brackets to the best I could and without modifying them a whole lot. So this was just kind of a test fit with that. And now we flip to the test fit that I ended up actually going with. This is before I cut the brackets. I'm going to have to, or at least the top bracket you're seeing, I end up grinding and cutting. So that's another thing you would have to do if you want to do this my way. So I understand why it would be simpler for people that don't have the right tools to just buy that bracket from STM and utilize that. But here you can see the basic mock-up I did to kind of figure out what I needed to do to my brackets. So this main bracket here that hangs down is the one I'm going to have to cut. Here you can see how close it is. It's very close to the frame rail there. I did end up tweaking it to give myself more room, as you're going to see later on as well. So this is one of the main brackets I had to modify quite a bit. So I ended up taking a cutoff wheel and grinding out, where I thought I had to remove pieces to make this work. The nice part about using these OEM brackets is that, all you end up doing then, if you do it this way, is just kind of removing certain pieces of it. You don't really have to add new places, new mounting points. So that's kind of a nice feature. And of course, the main advantage to me was really just utilizing 2 different mounting points and not just having one spot where it connects to the car. So I don't really know if anyone would ever completely copy what I did here, but just letting you know and showing you kind of the piece, the portion I cut out, what it looks like. I ended up bending the other bracket. I didn't have to cut this bracket that has the 2 mounting bolts where it bolts to the frame rail. I didn't have to cut that one. I just had to kind of bend it around a bit to make it sit where I wanted. And as you can see here, I had to notch out this one little piece as well on this bracket just to get it to fit really the way I wanted. So this is pretty close to the final piece of what this bracket looked like before, of course, I had to prime it and paint it because, this car is pretty nice. I don't think I should have anything rusty on this car, so I had to paint it. But if you plan on doing something like this and need more details on it, reach out to me on Instagram or something. Let me know if you have questions about it, about actually making the brackets. I can give you more details. But I ended up, as you can see, working in the dark now, doing another test fit after I let these dry. I wanted to do my final test fit after I painted them and make sure that these would mount up like I wanted them to. And yeah, everything worked out pretty well to utilize the OEM brackets. I had to build basically an extender piece. You need a little piece of metal to add to that other bracket that mounts to the car itself with the 2 bolts, the one I'm talking about bending. I had to basically to get clearance. So I had enough clearance for that top line so it wasn't right up against the frame rail. You basically had to push things out. You can see it a little bit here. And unfortunately, I didn't film it very well, again, because this was a learning process for me. I've mentioned this before, I don't like making how-to videos on something I haven't done more than once. And this is obviously my first time. But here you can see that bracket. There's a little piece where it connects the 2 brackets together, basically the oil cooler and that one bracket. But I was definitely pretty happy with how it finally turned out. But it took me a couple of days, honestly, to get it the way I wanted it. Next, something they don't give you instructions for, again, when you get this is like how to put the lines together, really. But basically this one piece of the line here, I'm not even sure the proper terminology for this, but I ended up, putting this on. It's tricky to get on because of the mesh. There's like a wire mesh around this hose to protect it, of course, but it's tricky to get these ends on. You kind of have to finagle it around and twist it on, push it on very hard. But I just showed you that shot of the hose because I believe you'd want that hose pushed up as far as you can to that connecting piece before you screw it in place, as I'm doing now, and then the 2 pieces kind of just screw together. And I will say too that if you're buying this like full STM kit, I think they should change a piece on it as well. So I'm going to give you that warning right now that one of the 90s, which I think they might have even changed that kit since I bought it, because when I bought it, they sent me like 2 45 or 60 degree elbows. And then I looked on the way the kit was, and then all of a sudden it said they had 90 degree elbows. Basically, yeah, you want a 90 or even a 120 for one of these lines. But here's both lines I ended up making. Again, I did this like a month ago, so I don't honestly remember. But I think I ended up modifying one of these and shortening a little bit. But roughly speaking, you can see this this one line here was about 20 inches or so. And again, I think I shortened up one of them. That's why this is not an exact how-to. You do need to cut this stuff, and it's tough to cut. If you buy the STM oil cooler kit, they're just going to give you a full like 5-foot thing, and then you cut it to the length you need. And I think one of the trickiest parts for this was, for me at least, I mean, these are pipe thread, apparently, the ends that go into the B&M cooler. So I did some research. I tried to figure out what I should use to prevent these from leaking, because of course it's an oil cooler. You do not want it to leak oil. And pipe tape is kind of what was recommended, but apparently pipe tape along with pipe dope is maybe what would have worked here. That is kind of what the go-to seems to be like in the actual plumbing industry, pipe tape and pipe dope. So that might work for this. But I'm just going to say, you know, I'm just going to give you my experience and what I learned from this. I tried this with pipe tape. I tried it without pipe tape, and it leaked like bad. Like it was leaking all the time. You need to be careful when you tighten these up. You can over tighten them. You can break things. So if you try to install this aftermarket oil cooler and it's leaking, don't just try to tighten it, because it doesn't work. Pipe thread works differently than like what you're probably used to with working on a car with a normal nut and bolt. So that forewarning up front, don't over tighten this if you are trying to install an aftermarket oil cooler with the pipe thread. So again, I basically did a bunch of test fits for this. Another tip I kind of have for you with this is, if you planned on like saying, oh, well, I'm going to change my oil anyway, I'll just drain my oil, run the new oil cooler, and you know, then I'll add my fresh oil and test everything. That's what I was going to do at first, and then I thought about it and I was like, you know what, that probably doesn't make the most sense, especially if I'm going to be leaking oil, because then I'm going to have to try to fix my leaks and stuff like that anyway, and then I'm just losing the new oil I added. And it was easier than I thought to actually just swap out these new lines, at least for me, because I had the oil cooler block off stuff, so just some plugs that went to the oil filter housing. I was able to pull those plugs and then fairly quickly add the new lines to that. So that was kind of nice that I could do that. So basically, I tested this a couple times with the old oil that was in it and ran it, which was actually kind of nice too, because then if you think about it, if there was anything in that oil cooler, any debris in there, obviously they're super hard to clean, and that's a reason you'd buy a new one anyways. You expect it to be clean. But if there was anything in there, at least then I ran it for a heat cycle, or at least a little while before, you know, just a little bit, just to run oil through that new oil cooler, and then I dumped it right away. You know, well, once everything was situated here where there weren't leaks, then I finally changed my oil. So as you can see, this was with the pipe tape. The pipe tape honestly just kind of like got eaten up, it seemed like, and it leaked, and it leaked pretty good. So after a bit more research, this is what I found that is working for me right now. I am hesitant to, of course, say this is what you should for sure use. I would love to hear someone else's opinion on this and find out what you used if you did install your oil cooler. But this Permatex aviation Formagasket stuff, you can get it at your local parts store. I have way more of it than I need at this point. But this sealant liquid this whole bottle was relatively cheap, I think under $10, and it, for me, seemed to work like a charm. I just put a little bit on the threads before I tightened it up, and that's all I used, and that took care of my leaks, at least as of now, so far. Again, I've been running it for about a month or so. It did seem like it, I wouldn't say leaked, but I don't know if it was just the stuff wearing in a little bit, like it was a bit sticky and almost like this stuff was kind of getting through, but it was way better than it was. Like I could handle, you know, if it did leak just a drop now and then, could handle that, compared to initially when I did it, it was like drop, drip, 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 like a constant drip. So again, I wish they gave you more direction on this. When you buy a kit like this, it would be nice if they did something to tell you more of these details, but hopefully this will help you guys out so you don't run into the same problems I did. And hopefully someone else too that has done this, you know, leave a comment section, let me know what you think. So once I tested that out and it wasn't leaking, I was like, great, I'll test a bit more. And I tested the clearance, and that's where I ran into issues. You can see that the tire here, basically at full turn to the left, it would rub against the actual line I had installed. Now I knew once I zip tied it and stuff, it would pull it over, but I did not like the way this looked. Again, I think this was about a 60-degree elbow, and I was like not having it. I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. I need to change this. So luckily there was a store close to me that carried these in stock. Thank you, Beyond Redline. And I ended up picking up a 90 that I think would originally come with this kit if you got it from STM. And then I also picked up a 120-degree, I believe it was, elbow, because they had it in stock. And I also want to say I think I cut a little bit off the line because I felt like there's a little bit extra slack in the hose. So I cut the hose a little bit shorter. Again, I don't fully remember. At least now I was to the point where I felt comfortable that everything wasn't going to leak. So I drained my oil, did my normal oil change, and, you know, removed the filter so you can get a better view here. I'll also say that these fittings that went into this oil filter housing, for those, I actually just used a little bit of blue Permatex. These are different, types of fittings than the pipe fittings that go to your oil cooler. So far so good for me. You don't want to overuse the Permatex, but I haven't experienced any, leaks with this. But I used the blue Permatex on the sides that went to the oil cooler housing, or the oil filter housing, rather, I should say. Again, I'm very curious if anyone's done this themselves, what they had used to prevent any leaks if they installed their own aftermarket oil cooler. And now I'm just showing the sped up process of me swapping these out, the different options we had. I was able to just pull out that old 60-degree one, loosen that up. You basically need some bigger wrenches for this job as well to get these fittings created or put in place. So yeah, there might be a reason that they don't give you directions on this when you buy the kit, but hopefully this is helpful for you guys. But of course, do anything you see in this video at your own risk. Be careful when you're messing with the oil from your engine. You can screw things up if you have a major leak or if you add any contaminant to your oil. So we had to do another test. We put the wheel back on after we swapped out that one angle, and as you can see here, successful. This is pretty much the final version of what it looked like. Lots of room now in there, a few inches actually. As you can see, the wheel is fully turned and there's lots of room in there. So that worked out excellent. And then actually a few days later again, because working when I can, I installed the fender liner as well, and everything fit pretty well. I was happy overall with this and how it all fit. And here's just a final walkthrough showing what everything looked like, the way I ran my lines, the way that I mounted this with the brackets. Of course, I utilized some zip ties here to try to keep everything, where I thought it should go the best, where it's away from the wheel and also being away, from the engine, the pulleys and everything like that. So as you can see, that one line, the longer line, does kind of run up and forward, and that's actually it runs up towards the front of the car and over the lower intercooler pipe, kind of on purpose, because if the 90-degree elbow coming off of that oil cooler went straight back, it kind of pointed right towards the wheel again. So I didn't see any harm in particularly running the line a little bit longer, running it forward like I did there. And what was really nice, again, with adding this tilt to it, basically, is that I could get to this top mount, or I should say this top line on the oil cooler. I could easily actually get that on and off, which came in very handy since I had to mount this a couple times and redo those lines a couple times. But of course, to finish this job, you're going to have to put your bumper back on, so I did that. And after it was on, just showing you that, this isn't the stock location, so it should still get some decent airflow. I was a bit surprised when I touched this how warm it got, but I haven't really compared it to see how much, if it felt much warmer than the OEM one like I have on my black car. I'm not really sure if this one performs any better than OEM, but it's definitely good to have this option if you had, an engine that was blown up or something, and you didn't, obviously you shouldn't risk reusing your OEM one if, or whatever one you had on when the engine blew up, you should end up swapping it out. So it's good to have this a little bit cheaper option if needed. And yeah, then we got the fender liner installed. It all fit up pretty well. It all clearanced fine. It wasn't the best condition fender liner, but it was good to have something in there to give it a little bit of protection again, because we're going out on dirt track. And if you watched my most recent video blog series all the way to the end, you saw that we did get this silver Evo up on the dyno, and we kind of determined that one of our main restrictions in horsepower was actually the stock O2 housing. So we weren't able to kind of get our boost to hold as much as we wanted at the top end. So I invested in this STM O2 Eliminator downpipe. Another time crunch here, so I only filmed little bits and pieces of it, but you can see the stock O2 housing here. I ended up pulling that out along with the busher downpipe I had. Dropped that as well. And then we put in this STM O2 Eliminator pipe. It went fairly well. There is one nut, basically, that I have no idea how you're supposed to get it on there unless you modify one of the studs that comes out of the turbo that it bolts to. So honestly, there's 4 out of 5 holding this thing in right now, so it seems to work fine that way, but it does seem like either a poor design or something, again, where maybe STM should send you a different stud that you would put in to actually be able to get to that nut. So again, curious if you ever had a similar issue installing in O2 Eliminator downpipe, did you have any issues with actually getting that that nut on? If you're familiar, if you remember, there's actually like 3 bolts, I believe, and then 2 studs with nuts that go to them. And then one of those nuts that goes to the studs, for me at least, could not really get it in there without modifying stuff. So 4 to 5 seemed right. So that is a lot, but yeah, it feels good. I wanted to get caught up. It's been very busy around here lately, so I wanted to update you guys with everything that happened on the Evo. I did most of this before I did spectator racing once with the car. I did it one night where there was only a couple matches, and it was good to get the car out on the track, get a feel for how it handled. So I did that, and then there was kind of the main event, the end of the year spectator racing at the fair that we got to do in the daylight. So that's always fun for better video footage. So I took it out there, and the car handled flawlessly. It ran great. They put a little water down right before my first run. So if you watch this run here, you can actually see like the back end of the Evo just kind of kick sideways as I launch it. So that had me a little scared that it was slippery out there. So I didn't accelerate a whole lot or power too much coming through turn 2 because I was a little worried that it might slide a lot again. So that's what made a very fun, actually entertaining race initially, to give this muscle car and better driver a chance to kind of come in and catch up. But the Evo still got a good amount of power, so it powered through, and we were able to win with that. So it was a lot of fun. Hopefully everyone found it entertaining, and hopefully people aren't too pissed off at me. I don't make the rules, guys. I just bring a car I like out to racing I like to do. So that's at least my theory on it. But yeah, I mean, I get that some people don't like that it's all-wheel drive and that's an advantage. But hey, bring your all-wheel drive cars out there then. I don't know why other people don't bring all-wheel drive cars out there. It's perfect for it. Should it be in its own class? I don't care, I guess. I mean, for me, it would just kind of stink if they made their own class for all-wheel drive, and then it's me and like one other car every week. Like, what's the point? Like, that's no fun. Like, I mean, not because like I beat up on other people, but it's no fun because you don't get to see like the variety. Like, it's fun having a variety of cars race against each other, and it's cool too to just show people what this Evo can do. Because again, this year I know there were people that didn't think it would win because they just, probably hadn't attended in the past or didn't know it was all-wheel drive or whatever, but I think it's cool to see a variety of cars race each other. Front-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive. A lot of horsepower versus a little horsepower, and yeah. And I get where people get bored of seeing the same car or same person win over and over again. I get that too. So, but it's all in good fun. I'm just out there having fun, that's for sure. So hopefully we'll be able to do it again next year. And but for now, spectator racing is done for the season. So actually, what's coming up next, hopefully, will be ice racing, and that's the next plan for this Evo. Either way, I think it's very cool to have this car back out and doing some racing, and of course, if you've been following along since the whole beginning of this, thank you, and hopefully you understand, like, it's cool to see a car like this actually still get out there and as rusty and as much crap as it needed when I first got it, and it's still rusty, and hopefully we'll continue the journey to fix some of that rust. But that's my rant that I just wanted to spiel out to you guys. So I just recently had a safety recall performed on my silver Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution. Now this particular safety recall is actually for a rusty front cross member. And this recall doesn't actually only apply to the Mitsubishi Lancer Evo, it also applies to some base Lancers and also some Mitsubishi Outlanders. So what I'm going to do in this video is walk you through how you can check to see if there's a safety recall on your vehicle. And I'm also going to share details about my story and what I had to go through and kind of how long it took, all those details to get this safety recall done on this particular Lancer. So the first thing you want to do if you're going to check for a recall on a Mitsubishi vehicle is go to this website, mitsubishicars.com/recall. And then most of this is about their airbag recall. That is one of their most popular ones, apparently. But you can check to see if there's a recall on any other recalls, specifically on your car, with a couple different links within this webpage. One specifically says, click here to check if your Mitsubishi has any open recalls. So once you find that direct page, it will open up this recall information a pop-up here, and you have to enter in your VIN number. So have the VIN number ready for your vehicle. You'll type that VIN number in here, hit submit, and then it should show you any open recalls for your car. And of course, the one we're talking about mainly today is this SR-16-003, and this is that front crossmember rusting issue. That's the one we're going to dive into a bit more later. But just for example's sake, here are some other potential recalls you might see, especially if you're an EVO owner. Again, there is the one for the airbags. You might see that. There's also one for a sticker that needs to be changed to update the correct weight of the vehicle. And then there's also one about reprogramming the ECU, and that one can be done as well. That's not a safety one though, that's just a different open campaign, it says. And that's it for step one. It's basically that simple. I mean, if you kind of just Google open recalls for your vehicle, you should get some basic information. And then you're just going to want to try to find, you know, the Mitsubishi or whatever car you have, find their original site, find their recall page, type in your VIN, and that should allow you to try to find any open recall for whatever vehicle you have. Also, this will show up on a Carfax. So if you did run a Carfax and there's an open recall, you may see this recall on your Carfax as well. So if it hasn't been fixed, it probably will still show up on the Carfax. So that's another way to kind of see if this fix should be done on your vehicle. So now let's dive deeper into my specific cross-member corrosion safety recall. I found this safety recall bulletin here, this 18-page document, providing some background. But for what most people watching my video probably want to know is it is for the 2002 to 2007 Lancers. That includes the base Lancer and the Evo. It's also for the 03 to 06 Outlander, and then the 2007 to 2013 V6 Outlander. And then if you note at the bottom of the page, I mentioned this in one of my Instagram videos, I believe, but it's kind of considered the Rust Belt area, where if your car was registered at some point in time within the state shown on the bottom of the screen here, those are the ones where you basically easily qualify for this open recall. Now, if it wasn't registered in one of these states and it's still having a rust issue, of course, I would still suggest taking it in. I think they would still cover it if you had this issue, even if it wasn't, for some reason, registered in one of these states. So now the cool part about following my videos is I will show you exactly what they're doing and exactly what part is going to be changed. So we're going to get the car up in the air to do that. And then before we show you the part underneath the car, here is the brand new crossmember that would go in, so you can get a feel for what this actually looks like. And once we're up underneath the car here, you're going to see the red arrow pointing to this new piece as it's been installed. And you may also notice that these other shiny silver pieces look pretty new as well. And that's because they were considered an incidental part of this process. So a really cool thing for me with getting this recall service done is I got entirely new lower control arms, lower ball joints, the lower bushings that are in those control arms. All that stuff was replaced as well for free, because basically they consider that an incidental. So anything that may potentially break while they're trying to fix this crossmember would be covered under that safety recall warranty work. Okay, so you may be wondering, how bad could it have been? Did it really look like that control arm was going to just fall out? Yeah, it did. This looked pretty bad. You could see that it just kind of started cracking, and this lower control arm could have basically just ripped out, and then your steering would kind of just shoot you off into wherever. So that's the reason it is a safety recall. You could see it's cracked up here, and that it basically cracked, you know, almost all the way around. It was still hanging on, but I definitely was not driving this car any further than I had to, just to get it to the dealer to get it fixed. And of course, my loyal viewers know that I usually like to fix things myself oftentimes, and you're probably the same way. You probably aren't typically taking your vehicle in to the dealer, but this is one where it's a lot of work, and you know, if you're going to get the parts for free, I would, you know, suggest probably still taking it in for this if you are needing this job done on your Evo. So what happened after I discovered how bad this was? Well, I Googled my local Mitsubishi dealer, tried to find the closest one that had a service shop, you know, that was an authorized Mitsubishi dealer as well. And then I called them to ask about my specific car and this recall. And this is how the phone call went.
The front crossmember recall that you're talking about?
Correct.
You know, so you'd have to inspect it first and do a punch test on it. Depending if it passes or fails. If it passes, they put a rust-proof coating on it. If it fails, then I gotta order a crossmember for it.
Okay. So, is there any limitation on that, or is there any, like, I never really did a recall before, so I wasn't sure if there was a set time limit on it or anything, or if anything else with the car mattered.
Nope, it doesn't expire. There's no expiration date on it or anything like that.
Okay. Well, I can guarantee you it'll fail the punch test. So, I guess if it's something I can get done, I would like to schedule it and get it in motion, I guess. And is that all? I assume it's all free?
Correct, yep, Mitsubishi would take care of that for you.
Okay. So, of course, I knew it was going to fail, but they had to inspect it to make sure it would fail first. And so I brought it in as soon as I could, which was about a week or so after I made the call. I brought it in, and sure enough, shortly after I brought it to them, they sent me a text message within the hour telling me, yes, it did fail, and they would order the part. Of course, if you've ever ordered OEM Mitsubishi parts before, you know it takes a good week or so. It was about a week and a half for them to get this new part in, and then they had a few issues apparently when they dropped it. I think they just had to end up ordering those lower control arms as well, and that took a little bit longer time frame. So all said and done, this basically took me about a full month. By the time I realized, you know, what had happened, I called them to make sure they could, you know, schedule it to even get it in to look at it. By the time I waited for them to get the parts, and by the time I got it fixed. The good news is you might be able to get a rental. If this is your only car, that might also be covered in this process if you needed. Although most of my viewers probably aren't worried about that as much as they might be worried about whether or not you can have modifications. And as you can see, I still had some modifications here, and they do not care about modifications. This isn't, at least the way I understand it, this isn't a situation where they're looking for excuses to not cover warranty work, because this isn't really warranty work, right? This is a safety recall. This kind of has to get done to make a car safe. So of course your car might not be this bad. You might bring it in and they may do that punch test, and if it passes that punch test, they'll just end up putting rust corrosion stuff, film on it, and send you on your merry way. So this isn't a guarantee that they're going to do all this work for you. But obviously, if you guys follow this series, you know how rusty this car was. And it's crazy to me now that this 200,000 mile rusty ass car actually has like a whole new front end on it, really. Like this whole front cross member is new, you know, these lower control arms are new, this engine is brand new. Like, it's so funny to me that that all this is new up front, but that's not really the point. The point is that they will fix this, and they did fix it for me. So hopefully, if nothing else, this gave you an idea of what to look for with your recalls. I know some of my viewers might also be hesitant to bring their, you know, precious Evo into a dealer and have someone else work on it. Again, I feel like this particular job, if you needed this done, it's probably worth bringing in and having it done at a dealer. Again, no cost to you. I was worried myself, believe me. I had double checked. I had asked multiple times. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't be charged for any of this, and I wasn't. So firsthand experience here, you know, from me. No charge. It was nice that they were able to get this all fixed up and taken care of. And I also need to say that this, you know, I'm based in the United States, so I don't know what Mitsubishi's warranty would cover anywhere else, but this is mostly for people that are viewing this in the United States. This is how the process went here when this, you know, recall was covered by Mitsubishi Motors North America. What's up, guys? We're going to try something a little different in this video. I'm going to do a video blog style, if you will. And I'm excited because it's ice racing season and I get a chance to take the Silver Evo out on the ice. So that is the plan. We are going to take the Evo, drive it an hour and a half each way out to the lake, and hopefully do some basically ice autocrossing, if you will. So she'll be out on the ice, sliding around and having some fun. So it's about 5 degrees outside, -10 with the wind chill, and cold start on the Evo, running E85. Usually it doesn't go quite on the first one. Oh, almost. So give it a little gas, go again, there she goes. Power steering is really loud. You really need to let her warm up before you drive it. It does not like to just be cold started and then driven. It's almost like it hits fuel cut if you just start driving. It just kind of falls on its face if you don't let it warm up a bit first. But hey, 1200 cc injectors, E85, 5 degrees. I'm not complaining. All right, so I went and got gas just to top it off with the E85 before we'd head out to go racing. And the power steering was really noisy when I started it, but now it's fine. It actually like was somewhat frozen or something, I'm guessing. I just checked the fluid level and it was like overflowing. It when I popped the cap for the power steering reservoir, it started squirting power steering fluid all around. So too much pressure maybe, too cold, not really sure, but should be all set. Running good so far. Alright, so I'm waiting in line for the first official timed runs that we're going to do. We're supposed to be able to get 5 timed runs this morning and then hopefully 4 in the afternoon course. So I got to do 3 practice runs, 2 of which were bad. That was pretty good. Yeah, I'm not getting out of this one. No. Look at it go.
Turn your wheels a little bit that way so you're pointing straight out.
Okay. Thank you. Basically got stuck twice, but the first time I got stuck I was able to get myself out. Second time I got stuck I had to get towed out. And the third run, thankfully, or I should say one of the runs I did, I managed to run the whole course, so that was good.
Not much to hold on to, just about that handle, that's about it.
Am I gonna need to hold on?
Oh yeah. Is that not awesome?
That was really cool.
It's pretty much one of the coolest sensations I've found in the car is ice racing on studs.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Because you can slide around, but you still have tons of grip to like go fast.
Yeah, you went really fast.
What?
That was really fucking cool.
All right.
I said now she's gonna come back and she's gonna ride you. She'll be like, why are you going so slow?
So that was about it for the day out racing on the ice. And yes, that studded tire Mustang was pretty much about 30 seconds faster than me per lap time. So it certainly made the Evo feel slow after riding in that thing. But I have to say, I'm just super happy that the car made it and it survived all weekend. So that was a big plus for me. It was fun just to get out on the ice and learn, you know, more car control. That's kind of what it's really all about. And, you know, if you really care about the overall placement, you know, everyone wants to do good. There was 18 cars in my class. I was 5th in after the morning sessions, but then on my best run in the afternoon, apparently I hit a cone. So that dropped me down to like 11th out of 18 people overall, which isn't really that good. But, you know, I think credit to most of the people that do this every weekend. You know, it doesn't matter as much what car you have, especially out there. It's really about car control, and it's really about not making those mistakes. And a lot of people that do these events do them on the regular, and they're good drivers for it. So credit to them. Again, it was a lot of fun. So as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching.
Welcome back to Ice Battle 2022. Kyle Heyer from Grid Life, joined by the folks from New Aerial Photography, joining us here again in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. We're racing on the ice. We've got a variety of cars that are here at the lake. A lot of Subarus and a Tesla and a couple Mitsubishi Evos. We've got the all-wheel drive cars coming out now for the first time, which is exciting. It's an HPDE time attack and autocross style competition with a couple different classes of vehicles, as I think this is the number 77. It's a 2003 Mitsubishi Evo driven by Paul Ellertson, whose previous best time was a 1:16.442. Now that's in seconds, so that is just shy of 2 minutes was his previous best. So I think if you're on a snow tire, you're probably drifting more than you're attacking the course like you would in a time attack car on slicks on a racetrack. Whoa, laying that tire out in the dirty snow and swings out the rear. Here, this is another car that belongs in this habitat, another all-wheel drive sedan that's kind of built for a little bit of the rally life, and this is certainly part of that. And what a blast. Thanks again to the ASM crew for putting this on and paving out the racetrack on this frozen lake in the middle of Stevens Point, Wisconsin.
Let's talk about rust on Evos. If you follow my channel long enough, you know this black one. This is a Texas car, clean, really no rust on it. Silver one, Wisconsin car, about as rusty as it gets. So if you're looking to see where your Evo might be hiding rust, you come to the right place. Let's take a look. So if you are familiar with the DSM days, a lot of times you'd look for rust in the strut towers in the front. That's a very common spot where they would end up rusting out, and that's where you would look to see, you know, if the car was still in pretty good shape or not. And I have to say that that's not much of an issue, at least that on this car. And since this car is super rusty in general, I kind of feel like it's not a common thing actually on the Evo. So you don't really deal with a lot of strut tower rust. That's not, you know, the big issue. I did clean this up once already and cleaned up some of the rust, and then you can see it's coming through. But this honestly isn't that bad. It doesn't really bother me. This strut tower rust, it's livable. The main area where you're gonna run into rust on an Evo that I would want to watch for is in the rear. So the rear quarter panels and underneath the rear chassis legs, as you call them, is kind of where you really want to watch for rust. As you can see this beauty here, how bubbly that baby's getting. That is just awful. And honestly, other than the looks part of it, this part doesn't really bother me so much because it's still functional. It doesn't really affect, you know, anything as far as the stability of the car and how the car would actually hold together. What we're going to show you in a second is what actually is really bad. So, you know, you can see here, it's kind of the common spots where it's going to bubble. We'll take a look and make sure there's really nothing. There's maybe, it's hard to see in there, but it's pretty solid in here. I mean, that's one spot I would check up in here, and then the rear chassis legs. So we're going to go underneath. If I was looking for rust on an Evo, the first thing I'd be doing is looking underneath like this. And I would look at what they call the rear chassis legs, which is this part right here, up here. That's where I'd be looking. Where the rear suspension components connect to the car, that's what I'd be looking at. I'd want to look for rust in those areas. Right up in here. Because that is, you know, a pretty structural part of the car. You want to make sure it looks good. And like I said, this is a clean car. This car, really no rust to speak of. So that's nice. Very good. And, you know, rust on other things is, you know, minor spots. This doesn't really actually look too rusty. Hard to zoom in there. But areas like that I'm not, you know, concerned with. My biggest concern is the chassis part of the car. And you're going to see now just how bad this can actually look. And if you follow me long enough, if you saw my gas tank video, you know how bad this can get. Let's see. This side is actually the better side in here. Doesn't look too bad. I'm pretty sure this other side's got a straight up hole in it. Let's see. Yeah. So it's straight up got a hole in it, a rust hole. And again, that part too doesn't even bother me that much. What really bothers me, and what you gotta watch for, is the rear chassis legs. And this still doesn't look too bad because you're not seeing the holes. There's the hole. Look at that. She's a beaut. There's a lot of rust up in here. I might splice in some footage of me showing this stuff before, but hopefully you can kind of see. There it is. This is pretty much rotted out. So there's really not a whole lot of support. If you got rear-ended, I think this car would crumple up pretty quick. And more concerning than that is actually where the chassis mounts, or the rear suspension mounts to those pieces. Again, tough to show you right now, but up in here, right around this area, that's where I would be looking. If I'm looking for rust, look where those rear suspension components connect. You're going to be able to take a better look. If you're actually looking at buying an Evo and looking at the rust, you're going to be able to take a probably better look than I can even show you right now. But hopefully, this kind of gives you a feel for where to look. Typically, you're going to have other stuff here in the way. You're not going to be able to see this so well, most likely. So you're going to have to really get your head up in here and look around a little bit to actually see this a little bit better. So just be forewarned. But sometimes even simple things like this is a good clue, obviously, that you might have more severe rust in other places. So, you know, this Evo, I kind of saved it in some ways. Obviously not fully yet, because this stuff, these rear chassis legs should be replaced, really. But that's a big job. But that's how rusty this Evo is, and this Evo is running down the road. I can't think of much else. Maybe we'll pop the trunk here. There's obviously a little bit of rust even up here. There's rust in the door sill. Not so much rust there. Typical spot for rust. This is actually one of the things I should point out. This is, I think, even where it was a little rusty on my black car. This is a very common rust spot. The brackets in here or whatever, it ends up holding water, and the brackets in the wing and stuff just end up rusting out this part. That's very, very common on the Evos. You see the rust up there a lot. And I'll probably cut in some a better shot of this, because if I can find it. But the back bumper here, this back tail pan, if you will, is actually pretty rusty. There you go. You can see it. Even from here, you can see how rusty that is. Of course, if you were looking at Evo, they're probably going to have a bunch of plastic pieces in here to cover up all this rust. Because typically you're not all stripped out like I am on here. But another thing I guess to note is really the rear strut towers even aren't bad here. Which is funny, because I did have an Evo once that had some surface rust back here, and it wasn't really a rusty car, but it had some surface rust back here. And I've never touched this one. I've never done anything back here as far as trying to even just cover it up a little bit.
So, strut tower rust's not really an issue on the Evos. At least as far as I've seen. Of course, if you watch my videos long enough, you know. Leave a comment. Let me know where you found rust on your Evo or where you think people should be looking. But the rear chassis legs are a big one for me. That's kind of the main thing that I'd be looking for. There's actually, this is the big hole. This is the foam from the rear bumper. And then you can see right down in here too. So that's it. That's basically the rustiest Evo in the world. I can compare it to my black Evo. You can take a look at the trunk in there. Of course, no rust down in the door sills here. And what's funny about these seats is I took these seats out of that silver car and I painted these, but they're already getting rusty again. Obviously, I didn't do a good enough job of cleaning up the rails, but these seats came out of that car, and that's why they look rusty, even though this car's not really rusty. So, this is more of what you'd probably see. You'd probably have this plastic covering, even more stuff on the floor. And I guess, technically, you can see this is kind of rusty on this one, even. But nothing too concerning. It's all solid. Won't hurt to treat it someday, but not bad. And of course, you go down here on this one, and there's no big old rust holes, so that's good. Struts, let's see. I think I might have sprayed these struts once just to make them look pretty. I'm not sure. They look like they're a different color. Either way, it's not obviously really rusty, so I wouldn't be concerned about strut tower rust necessarily on an Evo, but again, it's just my opinion. All this looks pretty clean. Would be cleaner if I took that stuff out. And yeah, I mentioned up in here, I don't really remember if this had a sign of that rust before. This car was completely repainted once, so that helps, of course, too. But again, Texas car, and that's what really helps, not driving it in the salt in the winter. That's what makes all the difference. We'll go under the hood of this one, just because it looks way nicer. Look at that. So, no real rust issues, of course, here. Oh, but you know what I did think of, and I don't know if I'll be able to show it very well. Underneath this fender, basically underneath this fender, is another spot that's going to hold water and get rusty. And I noticed that for sure on the silver car, and we're not going to probably be able to see it here, but this, because I have the fender liners in here, even though they like to, you'd have to pop them out to really see. But if you pop these fender liners out and you looked up here, you'll see a rusty car if it's really rusty. Again, not as much of an area that I'm super worried about structurally, and unfortunately I didn't take these out. But maybe if I have video of it, I might add it to this and overlay it. But basically, if you took this fender off, you'd see a lot of rust up in here. Or if you took this fender liner out and looked above this fender liner, you'd see a bunch of rust up there too. So that's another spot I'd look for rust. And then finally, hopefully you watched my video on the front subframe or whatever. I can't remember right now what it was called, but I had this one replaced under warranty. So that whole front crossmember was replaced. That's of course another spot I would watch for rust. That's a safety recall item that you can get replaced under warranty if it's rusty enough. So that's definitely a place I would look out for. And for mine, they replaced the whole lower control arms and everything, so that was very cool. This piece can also, and has gotten rusted out actually. This is off my black car, this one specifically, because the one that was on here was so rusted it wasn't really doing a whole lot. Another area where you can see I did my best to cover it up, but definitely still rusty on this lower radiator support. So you could always check there. And of course, as I generally do this shot, you can see down by the body pinch here, trying to focus on it, you can see how along that area where the whole body pinch is, it's definitely rusted out. And even in the back seat of this one, if you pull up the carpet in the back seat, you can see some rust spots as well. This right here is actually the carpet. Let's see, focus. Yeah, that's the carpet inside. So, you know, you thought your Evo was rusty. You ain't seen nothing. I don't think too many of them are going to be worse than this one, but hopefully it can give you an idea for what to look for. Underneath. And just how bad it can get and still be drivable. You know, I might play devil's advocate here, and I know people hate rusted cars, but I mean, look how bad this one is, and it's still on the road. I'm not saying I'm super confident in it all the time, mainly because of the rear chassis leg rust, but some of this rust, you know, if the rear chassis legs were replaced on this car, I'd be totally confident in it. I'm not worried about, you know, my feet falling through and doing a Fred Flintstone or something. Let's take a look under this one on the same side. In there, you can see actually a little bit. Get my finger out of the way. A little bit of rust. So I guess that's definitely a good spot to look for. And again, this is solid. This is clean. So I mean, to me, it's still pretty damn clean. Something like this definitely wouldn't deter me from buying a car, but to each their own. If you don't think that's clean, if you think that's a lot of rust, I guess that's your opinion. You can have that opinion and not buy that car if you want it, but for basically a 20-year-old car, it's nothing. It's good, solid, in my opinion. So hopefully that covers everything. The best spots I would look, again, the main thing for me would be those rear chassis legs. So if you were going to buy an Evo and you're worried about rust, or more importantly, actually if you are looking at one online, because that's what you're probably doing, you're probably looking at a car online, and if you're worried about being rusty at all, have them send you photos underneath of the rear chassis legs, or have them do a video like I did where they just poke a camera underneath and you take a look. You could even pull this wheel off and take a look if you're really serious about it, and if the potential seller would let you do that. Pull the wheel off, really take a look inside there, see what that rust looks like. Obviously, if you have signs like this on the outside of your Evo, you know there's more going on, unless it's already been fixed once underneath the Evo. Also, this is a whole nother area too, actually, where mine is rusty. I can show you that. Not a bad area to look at either. I don't remember if this pops. So, check in there. That's where it could rust as well. But that's it, guys. Hopefully you found this informative. $16,000. Yes, that is how much I have invested in this ugly and rusty Evo build. It's been just over a year and a half since I purchased this rusty car, which ended up having crank walk, but it was a full car, and I have since spent quite a bit of money and time getting it to the condition it is now, where it's actually a nice running, driving, pretty decent Evo in some aspects. But in this video, I'm going to break down the pricing and where I've spent most of the money. It probably won't come as any surprise that most of my investment is right here. This engine has a brand new OEM short block. The head was redone. A lot of other parts had to be purchased for this. And when I did the math, $6,000 is right here in the engine. If you basically just count the engine stuff, if you pulled out an engine and want to put it in a different car, that is about $6,000, which is
65% of my additional investment I put into this car, not including the original purchase price. And that's why the Evos kind of often get parted out, honestly, because even right now I have this car listed for sale for $14,500, which is less than I have into the entire car, but it hasn't sold yet. It's been up for sale for 2 weeks now, and I understand why it doesn't sell in some ways, but it's just, I think, an interesting dynamic to really point out why, you know, so many of these cars end up getting parted out. I feel personally that this full drivetrain of this car could be worth $10,000 to $12,000 as it is. Plus you get the bonus of, if you wanted the drivetrain out of this car, you could actually drive it and confirm it's all good. But anyway, back to the engine itself. This engine, of course, now only has 3,000 miles on the actual bottom end of the engine. Brand new OEM Mitsubishi engine. The head itself did have 200,000 miles on it, like the car chassis itself does, but it was reworked and redone to, you know, operate as it should. I also want to point out, and I will link to a spreadsheet in the video description, wherever they put the video descriptions on YouTube nowadays, but I do have a spreadsheet that you can check it out if you want to see a breakdown of everything and where I actually spent all my money. Even though I have $16,000 invested, that's technically money I did spend on parts. I did recoup some of it in certain ways, selling parts that were on the car. Like this came with the Evo 9 Turbo, which I put on, but it also came with an Evo 8 Turbo, which I had sold. And it came with a better valve cover, which I sold and replaced with one that had a broken ear, because this is the ugly Evo build, and I didn't care if it was ugly. That was kind of the point. So if you want the full breakdown, if you're really interested, I do have a spreadsheet linking all the parts I bought and what I paid for what was new, what was used. Most of this stuff was all new. A lot of OEM components, especially in the engine compartment area. And that's also another reason why I understand this car is a hard sell, a hard one to sell, because when you first look at the car, you're like, well, it's a Rusty EVO with over 200,000 miles on it, and that's true. But most people fail to really recognize or pay attention to the fact that it's a $6,000 engine, and it's a brand new, you know, pretty much brand new OEM engine, and you don't see that every day. And because this Evo was rusty, the second worst part, or the most money I spent on this, is towards the rear, and it's actually with the fuel tank. And if you followed this build series long enough, you know I spent a lot of time on the fuel area, so let's move back there. Honestly, one of the things I'm happiest I got to do with this car is play with the JDM fuel tank and make sure it would fit. You know, a rusty Evo is going to become an issue, I think, that more people are going to have to deal with in the United States. And the Evo 8 and Evo 9s are just pretty rare in the United States, but they're actually less rare in other parts of the world. So if you can get JDM parts that will actually fit and work okay, it's good to know that they will work. So especially when it came to the fuel tank, this one had a rusty fuel tank that was just leaking and had some other issues. If you go back and watch some of my video series with the build, some not so good work done putting the fuel pump in and stuff like that. So this fuel tank just needed to be removed, and I did that. I got the JDM fuel tank to fit. It actually fit just fine. There were definitely some modifications that needed to be made, but I did swap that out, and then the fuel fill hose was actually leaking as well. Again, discontinued part. You cannot get a brand new gas tank for a US market Evo 8 or 9. You can't get the brand new fuel fill hose for an Evo 8 or 9. So I went the JDM route as well for the fuel fill hose. And I made that work. I don't think I actually made a video about that because it works, but I don't think I'd recommend other people doing it unless you really, really had to. But this is a cost pricing video, and I did spend about $800 on the fuel system, as I would call it, towards the back. I also bought the fuel injectors. I'm kind of counting the fuel injectors as part of the engine cost, as if I would sell the engine as it is with the injectors in it. So in the back pricing, we have about $800 in fuel system stuff. Again, fuel tank, all the gaskets, all the miscellaneous nuts and bolts and different things I need. Again, I made a full video about JDM fuel tank and a lot more information just about the fuel tanks on an Evo in general. That's like 40 minutes long. So if you really are interested in the Evo fuel tank, I recommend you check out that video. On top of the $16,000 invested total in this car, there was actually over $1,000 worth of warranty work that was still covered by Mitsubishi's warranties on the EVOs and some Lancers. That was for the front crossmember and the front lower control arms. So if I had to pay for those, if it wasn't covered under warranty, that would have been another additional $1,000, $1,100, $1,200 that I would have had to have paid to get this car functioning as it is as well. So that is a quick breakdown of how much money I've spent and where I've spent the money on this ugly Evo build. And I don't make this video to brag about how much money I've spent on this car. It's really more to show you guys how much it can cost to build something like this. And especially if you watch my roller build of my black Evo, you know that all these little things add up and you end up spending a lot of money. And even in this case, this was a full car where I technically shouldn't have had to have bought many things. Like I didn't need to buy the transmission, I didn't need to buy the transfer case, little nuts and bolts. I still had to buy some little nuts and bolts because a lot of those broke off because they were rusty. But again, the main point is I have technically over $16,000 invested in this car, and right now it's for sale for $14,500, and it's not selling, you know, like that. And there's a reason for that. Like usually if you can save up your money for the Evo that you want, you might be better off financially just buying that Evo. Hopefully if it was done right, that was, you know, a good Evo, good investment, even if you're spending a little bit more for that Evo. However, I will say I don't like regret doing this car the way I did, of course, because I'm kind of a YouTuber. I like to do this YouTube video stuff for fun. I like to try to share some knowledge of what I learn along the way, document the differences between the Evos, things like that. So for me, I certainly don't regret it, but it wasn't the best financial decision, of course, at this point. But who knows, maybe further down the line, some of my videos will bring in some more ad revenue and it will pay off in the long run, who knows. And also, you can't really put a price on the fun that you can have with a car when it's done. I got to go ice racing with this car like 3 times, brought it spectator racing twice. So the fact that I got to do those things, and anyone that actually does racing knows how much those can kind of add up and how much you usually end up spending on the cost to go racing. So if I do happen to actually sell this car for, you know, just a little bit under what I have invested in it, and I got to beat on it, have some fun, cool, you know. That sounds like a win to me. One final item I want to talk about with this car. As I'm telling everyone that is potentially looking at buying it, I do recommend new chassis legs, that it would need new chassis legs. And I did recently get a quote, and I thought other people might be interested in the price for the actual chassis legs that you can get, basically the JDM versions, which should work. Haven't done it yet, of course, so I'm not going to fully say it will, but from what I gather, you could definitely make those ones work. But they're going to run you just under $2,000 most likely right now. A lot of prices are in flux with stuff in the world right now with inflation and supply chain issues. But just a heads up, if you were looking at rear chassis legs, I was looking through Ross Sport. You may have heard me mention their website before, but that is also going to be an option for me with this car potentially in the future. It will cost probably more to get them replaced than it would to buy them, referring to the rear chassis legs. But at that point, if I replace the rear chassis legs in this car, then I have a really good to go, I would say. That's one of the final things I would really want to fix on this car before I'd feel, you know, really good about driving this car, you know, almost anywhere. It would still look ugly. It would still have some rust here and other spots, but that's okay because that's kind of what I'd like to have. I'd like to have an ugly, rusty, well, I don't want rust, but you know what I mean. I don't mind that one would be rusty as long as it's actually solid and safe to drive. So that's it for this video, guys. I just thought I'd share a breakdown of where I've spent a lot of the money on this car. If you are interested in purchasing, I guess this was kind of maybe a for sale ad for this thing, but I'm located in Wisconsin, and you can message me if you are interested in buying. If not, that's cool too. I'll just keep it and have some fun with it, or have you know, a lot of spare parts for my other Evo. As always, this is Paul from Boosted Film saying thanks so much for watching.